Warning, this video contains very disturbing subject matter and also graphic imagery. If you are sensitive to topics such as eating disorders, drug abuse, domestic violence, child abuse, sexual war and please do not watch this video as the video contains all of these topics. Lastly, this video is heavily censored, so please don't demonetize and age restrict me YouTube, thank you. The Mega PSA Iceberg. This is now my biggest iceberg on this YouTube channel, after the Ultimate PSA Iceberg, which this is basically an extended version of that iceberg. Because as I said in my Ultimate PSA Iceberg video, I do want to actually extend it and make it bigger, and this is that video. The iceberg has over 220 entries, and it has 5 tiers, and the further we go down the tiers, the more disturbing they will get. I've talked about these PSAs a lot before, so hopefully I don't repeat myself too much, but there are a lot of new PSAs on here that I have not talked about before, which will be interesting. Timestamps to each layer are in the description down below, as well as links to all the PSAs that are mentioned in this video. Lastly, before I get into this iceberg, my Patreon is in the description, it's all back up. I'm going to be posting on there, getting stuff out to all you patrons, so it's not just sitting there doing nothing. I will actually be pushing content out for all of you. By the way, the support of my childhood trauma video has been amazing. I can't believe how much support I got in a video that isn't PSA related. It is absolutely amazing. I can't thank you all enough because I really enjoyed making that video. Anyways, let's get into the iceberg. Tier 1. Not scary. Smallstep.gov. Smallstep.gov is a PSA campaign from AdCancel that encourages people to change the ways they do things in their life with their health. All of the PSAs follow different scenarios where people find parts of the body that seem to be overweight, such as the stomach, hips, double chin, and even those fat peaches. I'm pretty sure the campaign was ending in 2004, as all the PSAs I could find of this campaign are only from 2004. They basically use the ideas to stay healthy that are on their website and make PSA out of it to convince people to do some of those steps. Smokey Bear PSAs. This is an American campaign telling the viewer that only you can prevent forest fires from the company AdCancel. This campaign in particular started in 1942 when the US government lost the rights to use Bambi in their fire safety PSAs. After losing the rights, Smokey Bear was finally created in 1944 with a long-running slogan of the campaign, "Only you can prevent forest fires," was created in 1947. There have been many different PSAs made using Smokey's likeness. Some are good and deliver a good message to the viewer in a well-done way, and there are other PSAs that I mentioned in my last iceberg that are just confusing. Even with the weird PSAs Smokey Bear has had over time, it's still the longest running PSA campaign of all time. McGruff the Crime Dog. McGruff the Crime Dog is another series of PSAs from the company AdCancel. This series of PSAs started back in 1981 and mainly had PSAs about, well, crimes. The most well-known one in the series is about kids talking to strangers, where McGruff tells us how 60 kids disappear every day in the US and that you shouldn't talk to strangers because they might have the intentions of kidnapping you. Even Family Guy had a skit where Brian becomes McGruff's sidekick in the well-known PSA that I just mentioned. AdCancel made quite a few PSAs with McGruff all the way through until about the late 90s, which I've seen. The series is still around as there is a McGruff the Crime Dog YouTube channel, but they seem to have separated from AdCancel at one point. Also, I haven't watched the recent Chip and Dale movie, but he shows up in the background in one scene, and that's interesting. Danny Elfman PSAs. There are only 2 of these PSAs I could find, and they're both from 1986, and are set in the exact same place as they're both represented by the LA Sheriff's Department. The first PSA talks about drinking and driving, whilst the other one talks about not doing drugs. I just find it weird that Danny Elfman says he's from Oingo Boingo for people to recognize him. By the way, if you don't know who Oingo Boingo are, they made songs like Weird Science for the movie of the same name, Dead Man's Party and Stay. Nowadays, Danny Elfman's known for his movie scores, such as his scores for Nightmare Before Christmas, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, and Tim Burton's Batman. Also to note, he's made scores for almost all of Tim Burton's movies. Anyways, the PSAs themselves just have Danny talking to the viewer about these topics and saying that you shouldn't do those things. And for drink driving, Danny tells you to literally take any other option to get home before even thinking of drink driving. Tips for former smokers. Tips for Former Smokers is a series of American PSAs under the company's Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC for short. The PSAs were aired around 2012-2014, and they center around people that have suffered long-term effects from smoking, trying to give other smokers tips to deal with the effects that they have. The most well-known out of the campaign are definitely Terry Hall's PSAs, but they all do serve the same purpose, so I don't really have much else to say about this campaign. Be Travel-Wise. A Canadian PSA released in the year 1986 follows a few puppets of geese arriving back in some Canadian airport. The wife puppet discusses how people can't bring certain things back, like animals from other countries and plants, as they may carry diseases. But is there really anything else to say about this one? It's literally just puppet geese coming back from somewhere with items that they shouldn't have. That's literally it. The Real Cost. A lot of American PSAs. So The Real Cost is a company that started making PSAs in the 2010s and is trying to tell the viewer not to smoke by telling them different things cigarettes do to your body. Some of their most well-known PSAs are definitely the ones from around 2014 where people have to give up more than cash to pay for their cigarettes, such as smooth skin and teeth. The company still makes PSAs telling people not to smoke. So I really don't have much else to say about this company, and their PSAs are just kind of average. Besides the ones I just talked about before, the 2014 ones where they have to pay their cigarettes with more than just money, they have to give up something else. And I know those kind of traumatize kids when they're younger too, but I don't really have anything else to say. This job will break you if you let it. Yet another candy eating PSA, but this one's a very recent one as it was only released last year as of recording this. It follows a woman being overworked in an office, staying until extremely late hours, stressing that she may get fired if she doesn't keep on staying. When she's in the office, a biscuit comes to life and sings to the worker that she should go home, and how staying at work all the time is affecting everyone else around her. Also, let me say that hearing a PSA say words like fuck and shit is really strange. Listen. This 60-second long PSA from the American company No More made a PSA that aired at the time of the 2015 Super Bowl. Also, it's apparently the first ever Super Bowl PSA to address domestic and sexual assault, and the PSA was actually funded by the NFL. So the PSA lets us listen to a real phone call to the authorities where a female pretends that she's ringing to a pizza shop to try and get out of her abusive situation. The PSA visualizes a messy house with a sink full of dishes, a messy bed, and a hole in the wall, as well as a few other things as we hear the phone call to get a good idea of why she's ringing the authorities. Text fades in at the end of the PSA to say, when it's hard to talk, it's up to us to listen. He-Man. A PSA that was released sometime in the 80s, that it's actually from the show He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, follows the characters He-Man, She-Ra, and Orko. The characters talk to the viewer about inappropriate touching and how you should tell someone if you've been touched wrongly. I don't know, I just always found it weird how kids' animated shows have to have messages for kids at the end of each episode or just randomly on TV. It's one of the weirdest things in the 80s that I will never understand. Francis the Firefly. Francis the Firefly is a 90s PSA from Fire Kills in the UK, and it's an animated short to tell kids not to mess with matches. They do this by showing the main character Francis getting convinced by Cocky Roach the Cockroach to use a match because Francis doesn't light up like the other Fireflies. When Francis uses the match, he accidentally burns his wings in the kingdom. After that happens, he meets with the king to give us a reminder to never play with matches. Dog in a hot car. This is a PSA that was released in 1987 from the American Humane Society, basically telling people not to leave dogs in their cars. PSA explains that leaving your dog in the car on a hot day could kill your pet as they can suffer really bad heat stroke in temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 43 degrees Celsius. It's just a pretty simple and straightforward PSA without any graphic imagery. Charlie Says. A simple series of stop-motion paper animated public information films from COI in 1973. The PSAs play at a few different events with Charlie the cat and the boy. The Dreading PSA, which I've talked about quite a few times, follows Charlie playing in puddles with a boy near a lake until Charlie accidentally jumps into the lake and almost drowns. It's until the dad fishes out the cat of the lake that the message is delivered to the viewer when Charlie and the boy are at home. The boy tells the viewer to stay near your parents and to be careful around water. In another PSA, we follow Charlie as he watches sausages cook on a stove. Little bits of oil splash onto Charlie, and then Charlie walks away until the boy tells us to stay away from stoves and that there are many hot things that can hurt you. In the last PSA I'll mention, Charlie and the boy are playing in the playground until a man comes up to the boy and asks him if he wants to see some puppies. He says yes, and as he's about to go with the man, Charlie comes in to stop and tell him that he shouldn't go with the man that he doesn't know. They both end up going to their mother and telling them about what happened. The mother says that they did a good thing, so the boy got an apple and Charlie got a fish. Partnership for a Drug-Free America. This is an American company that made plenty of PSAs trying to tell people not to do drugs, and it was founded in 1985. Partnership for a Drug-Free America has made so many different PSAs, from well-known ones like This Is Your Brain on Drugs, Cleaning Girl, I Learned It By Watching You, to really weird, less well-known ones like Join the Party, Puppet Strings, and I'm Not a Chicken. To be fair, Partnership for a Drug-Free America did make some great PSAs like I've mentioned before, Cemetery, Everybody's Doing It, and Nebraska Couple. The PSAs that Partnership for a Drug-Free America made were shown to actually make more people do drugs, mostly in preteens. In 1996, weed use had actually doubled in that age demographic, which is actually wild. Concerned Children's Advertisers. Concerned Children's Advertisers is a Canadian company that made plenty of PSAs throughout the 90s and early 2000s, trying to educate children about many different topics. Their most well-known PSAs are probably Hip Choice, House Hippo, and Don't Put It in Your Mouth. The Concerned Children's Advertisers have actually made some great PSAs, such as Rehab and The Trap, which are honestly masterpieces. They do have PSAs like Ice Scream and Head, which are just strange. The Head PSA apparently traumatized a lot of young Canadians when it was aired, and is seen as disturbing when the head falls off, and honestly, I can see why. Crash Test Dummies Vince and Larry. The one PSA series I have talked about so many times in the past. I have a full video on their history from how they started off and how they ended up being. So if you want to watch that video, links in the description, or will be a card up on screen at the moment. So for everyone that doesn't actually know about these PSAs, I will give you a quick little rundown on their PSAs and what they managed to do. So this is an American PSA campaign from Ad Cancel that decided to come up with a campaign to start getting people to buckle up, as only about 14% of people in 1985 actually buckled up. Both Jim Ferguson and Joel Machat came up with the idea to create two crash test dummies that loved doing their job of being a crash test dummy. This idea came to them after they were thinking of making the PSAs more disturbing, where the dummies were being dragged into getting into car crashes. So they ended up making it more lighthearted, which is a brilliant approach that actually aged really well. The campaign ran for 12 years, with the last PSA being Backseat Baby in 1997, and the campaign proved to be very successful and probably one of the most successful PSA campaigns of all time. It actually spawned a toy line from Tyco and a pilot for a TV series that actually didn't go anywhere, and it would have actually been the first CGI animated TV show if it actually went through. No other PSA campaign's done that. Anti-Piracy Australia PSA. So this PSA is pretty much an everyday video I remember watching when I was younger, when it came out throughout the 2000s. In the PSA we hear a narrator talk about how Australia makes great movies, even though they're actually showing Happy Feet, which I wouldn't consider to be an Australian production. But she talks about how pirating is ruining the Australian film industry as we see the poster burn. The narrator says that burning or pirating movies may seem harmless, but what you're really burning is the future of our film industry, as the text "what are you really burning" shows up. As I've said before, this isn't really a good example of a non-Australian film, because most of the people in this movie and most people that worked on it aren't Australian, even though like the effects and the animation was probably done in Australia. The rest of it wasn't. Keep It Real. Keep It Real is a PSA released in 2020 from the New Zealand government, and it tackles the topic of monitoring what your kids are looking up on the internet. They do this by having a naked male and female walk up to the mother's door saying that they're here for her son, and that her son watches them all the time on different devices. Also, honestly, this PSA is pretty damn funny, and I really like the approach, as they do talk a bit about how in prawn videos they don't discuss consent or any serious things that people need to know about with these acts. It ends with the mother telling her son that they need to discuss the differences between seeing things online compared to real life, which is a good message for viewers, even if it isn't just about this, like it's just in general about being on the internet. Dumb Ways to Die. This is a PSA released in 2012 from the Australian company Metro Trains. If you haven't seen this PSA by now, I'm really surprised, because it blew up around the time of its release, and it actually spawned 2 different phone games. The PSA sings a song about dumb ways to die while showing dumb ways to die in a cartoony way. The message gets delivered when the dumb ways to die are things to do with trains, and finally at the end of the PSA, the message "Be safe around trains," a message from Metro, is delivered to the viewer. As I mentioned earlier, this PSA absolutely blew up everywhere. Not only just for the state of Victoria and Australia, but the video blew up worldwide on YouTube, and I still think it's the most viewed PSA on YouTube. I think it blew up so much because it was so different from other train safety PSA campaigns. For example, I remember seeing so many disturbing train safety PSAs, and some were even from Metro, and when this came out it was just so unique and fresh. By the way, as I've mentioned before, as someone from the state of Victoria, I still see print PSAs based on dumb ways to die at train stations, and it's been that much of a success that Metro Trains, even though the campaign is a decade old, still shows these ads. Lastly, I just found out now, but Metro Trains actually licensed the campaign to other companies such as RTD and Denver, so obviously other countries wanted a piece of their pie as well. The anti-drug / above the influence. Both of these campaigns are American PSA campaigns trying to tell people not to do drugs, which most of the PSAs I've found with both companies are about not smoking marijuana. But these PSAs mainly showed up in the late 90s, early 2000s, trying to tell people to stay off drugs, even though the company Above the Influence made some absolutely terrible PSAs like Flat. Even Family Guy made fun of this PSA. But from what I could gather, neither of these PSA campaigns did well at all and didn't make people stop doing drugs. Pee Wee Herman. This is probably one of the most infamous PSAs of all time, and it features Pee Wee Herman himself, Paul Reubens. As I've said before, the backstory to this PSA is a lot more interesting than the PSA itself. Long story short, what happened is Paul Reubens had to make a PSA in 1991 after he was required by court to do 75 hours of community service after getting in trouble for smacking it in an adult theatre. With the 75 hours he was given, he decided to make this PSA and another PSA featuring a character from Pee Wee's Playhouse called Penny. This Pee Wee Herman PSA is in a series of PSAs which are all basically the same but feature different celebrities such as Clint Eastwood, which yeah, the other PSAs are better since you can actually take those celebrities seriously. You can't really take Paul Reubens seriously, sorry. The Search for Signs of Intelligent Life. This is a British PSA that was released in 1988, and it tells people to be smart with their car. They do this by having 3 weird aliens breaking into their car and stealing the car when the narrator says that it doesn't take an intelligent life form to steal from an unlocked car. Just a pretty simple PSA, but the aliens do look really strange. Like, I don't know what they decided to do with these people, but oh my god, they look weird. Most shocking second a day. This 2014 PSA from Save the Children in the UK follows a young girl living in London and plays out the situation if London end up turning into Syria. The PSA does this by showing how a normal day is in London until the whole area turns into a war zone and the family have to try and get out to stay alive. This is meant to show that just because it doesn't happen where you live, mostly in the UK where it's aired, it isn't like it doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. And the PSA ends with the hashtag #SaveSyriaChildren. MTV PSAs. Most of you probably had no idea that MTV made PSAs, but they were made in everywhere besides America. Basically, the MTV PSAs that were made were actually made in Italy and also in the UK. But most of these PSAs came out around the 2000s. There's about 6 of these PSAs I could find, but I only talk about a few of them. In one of the PSAs, it follows a couple in a cornfield making out and eventually start going at it, until one of the corn cutters comes and runs them over as the text pops up saying, "Unprotected can be dangerous." Another one of their PSAs follows a man in a nightclub in a bathroom as he tries to walk out of the bathroom. He ends up back in one of the toilets, continuing the same cycle over and over again, until we see him stop behind a wall as the text pops up saying 68% of drug users think they can always get out of it comes up. The last one I'll talk about follows a few drunk people in the back of cabs around the Christmas time and they're all acting like idiots. People in these PSAs made themselves look terrible as they're very drunk, and the PSA ends with the text, "Real idiots drive themselves home." Obviously telling people not to drink and drive, and that the better option is to get a cab or get a lift by someone else. Love Has No Labels. Love Has No Labels is a 2015 PSA from the American company I've discussed quite a few times now, Ad Cancel. The PSA takes place on Valentine's Day, where there's a massive X-ray set up with people from different races, orientations, and religions going behind it. Each time people come out of the X-ray, it will say things like "love has no labels," "love has no religion," and "love has no race," etc. The PSA was a pretty big deal when it was released, as not many PSAs talked about just loving people for who they are and not judging someone for their beliefs, orientations, race, etc. 1000 horsepower. An Aussie PSA from the government of South Australia decided to make this PSA under their road safety campaign, and it shows a group of horses running as some rope is getting less loose. The narrator comes in to talk about how trains' engines are over 1000 horsepower. The narrator stops as we see a man tied to the ropes and that the horses are attached to. The man wakes up as it cuts to the same man avoiding running into a train. Then the narrator comes back in at the end of the PSA to say, "Think about that before you cross the tracks." Mascaras. Mascaras is an anti-alcohol PSA from the Argentinian company SITEA. In this PSA, we see a man laughing with a mask on, and as I've said before, the music just reminds me of Sonic CD. Like, listening to this again, it sounds like something straight out of Sonic CD. But the PSA keeps going on where the man in the mask is drinking and laughing, but the music starts to speed up more and more until the man turns around and we see a sad face. The PSA ends with the happy and sad mask next to each other as the narrator narrates in Espanol. So what the narrator is roughly saying at the end of the PSA is these are the two faces of the same problem. When you drink alcohol in excess, alcohol ends up taking you. Which, hey, it's actually not a bad message, just a really strange PSA. I guess it's because of the language barrier, and maybe they think this is a bit more normal in that country, but I don't know, over here it just seems really odd and strange. Alone. A 1993 PSA from the company AIDS Information Center in Japan shows an animation of an arrow getting approached by a man as it starts to move. The man gets attracted to the arrow and even starts to hump the arrow, obviously symbolizing sex. The arrow seems to confess something, and then after pulling on the arrow, the text AIDS comes up. I personally see this as the partner confessing to the other person that they got AIDS, and then as the text comes up, it starts to get worse for them. After that, a crowd of people come up to him, and the man explains something to them. As he does, the text of AIDS says goodbye to symbolize that the partner dies from AIDS. When that happens, two people come up to try and tell him that they won't leave him alone. The PSA is kind of strange, but it's also interesting. #rough life. An American PSA that was released in 2015 from the company Friends of Animals follows Danny Trejo in a dog suit, which just sounds extremely strange. But Danny Trejo talks to the viewer about the experiences he has as being a dog. I don't know, I just find this one really weird as the PSA is pretty self-explanatory. It just follows the daily life of a dog that hasn't been adopted by a family. But it's just strange to see an actor like Danny Trejo in a PSA like this, and especially to see him in a dog suit acting like a dog. It's just weird. 2000s EPA Mercury PSA. So this is a random 2000s PSA where the PSA had a narrator talk about mercury and how dangerous of a substance it really is. The PSA talks about how much mercury can spread around very fast, and that there's a skull that talks to the viewer about how much it can spread, and that the EPA can deal with the mercury property, and if you see it, you should call them immediately. Personally, I don't really find this PSA scary, but people might be scared of the skull that shows up because it kind of caught me off guard a little bit when I first saw it. But besides from that, it's pretty tame. 911. 911 is a controversial PSA that came out in 2009, released in Brazil from the company WWF. As the title suggests, it follows the events of the three numbers and talks about how the tragedy killed 2,819 people. But the PSA amplifies it by adding a lot more planes headed toward those buildings. Then it cuts to text saying that a tsunami in 2005 killed 280,000 people, and that's 100 times the deaths of the 2001 tragedy. But after the dick measuring competition between both tragedies, the PSA tells us that our planet is brutally powerful, and that we should respect it and conserve it. I don't know if it's just me, but I don't think the message really matches with what the PSA is showing. Forest. Forest is a PSA that's pretty obscure, as I feel like I'm like one of the only people that remember this PSA. But this PSA follows a few businessmen in suits walking into a forest as they approach a man dressed up as a bunny. Yeah, this is a really strange one. But the men in suits tell the bunny called Bob that he has to leave because they own his home. As they go up to tell Bob to leave, he runs up to one of the co-workers and knees him in the balls. Bob then runs the other direction as chainsaws start up. As we hear them start up, Bob ends up walking to an area of the forest they've already cut down. We hear Bob scream the typical, "No!" as text comes up saying 1.5 million trees are cut down every day to make cigarettes. Which, by the way, I still don't know if that's true or not. All Things Dark and Hideous. A 1990 PSA released in Scotland from the company FOE follows the camera going over the planet Earth from space as a song that I don't recognise is being sung in the background. After that, the PSA fades to black where the text, "If you're concerned about what's happening to our environment, contact Friends of the Earth." Go Electric. A Canadian PSA from 1984 made by the company Ontario Hydro shows a furnace that has a face and talks. Yeah, it's literally the only reason why this PSA is on this list. But the furnace is singing about how it's making oil bills rise as the narrator comes in telling the viewer that they should switch to an electrical furnace to save money on their bills. The PSA ends with the text "Go Electric" coming up. Greenpeace. This is a Canadian organisation, believe it or not, out to preserve the lives of animals. I thought this company actually was founded in the UK, but no, it was founded in Vancouver in 1971. But this company is known for their PSAs such as "Everything is Not Awesome," which is going against LEGO's partnership with Shell, and a recent PSA called Turtle Journey, where they partnered with Aardman Animations, which are well known for making Wallace and Gromit, Chicken Run, as well as quite a few animated films and shorts. That doesn't say that Greenpeace doesn't have some more disturbing PSAs. Which one of their PSAs will come up later, but as most of them go, they aren't really that scary. Spider-Man, register to vote. You might be thinking they really decided to make a Spider-Man PSA? Yep, but this time Spider-Man wants you to vote. This PSA released in 1992 from the company VSDA follows Spider-Man talking to the viewer about how voting can help the future of your country. The main disturbing thing about this PSA is the music with a mixture of the dark background. Everything else is alright, it's just that. Also, seeing Spider-Man tell the viewer to vote is really weird, and hear him just saying how serious it is and that how important it is, it's just strange. Extreme meth over. A 2000s PSA from America by the company Drug Free Arizona parodies the typical dating game shows. The PSA does this with a 70s style set. It's literally copying like a dating game and whatnot, and it has all the 70s looking fonts and the flowers all over the set. The host tells us that meth will change your life, as images show how meth changes your appearance from your arms to your face. The PSA ends with a rep from the company talking to the viewer about how big of a threat meth really is. Under the Sheets. Under the Sheets is a 2010 PSA released from the German company Deutsche Tierschutzbund. Yes, I know the pronunciation would be shit. And it follows a woman getting undressed to join her partner in bed for some frisky time. She joins him in bed in the weirdest way possible by sneaking into the bed under the sheets from the end of the bed. She sneaks up to his chest area and then pulls a knife to stab him, as we hear the most stock man screaming sound effect there is, and it's just hilarious. That's literally the reason why this PSA is only on tier 1, because the sound effect cracks me up every time. The PSA cuts to black where text in German comes up, which roughly translates to "no castration of piglets without anesthesia" for a new animal protection law, which is broken English, but this PSA was about animal and how slaughterhouses treat piglets? What? The Pirates Are Out to Get You. The Pirates Are Out to Get You is a PSA from the UK company Fact that was released in 2002, and I've talked about this one way too many times. It follows a man as he's burning a bunch of DVDs and VHS tapes as a narrator tells us that the pirates are out to get you. The narrator goes on about how piracy affects many different industries and encourages terrorism apparently. I just find this PSA hilarious because the man pulls off the funniest faces of mankind, and the whole PSA is just extremely exaggerated and way too serious. It just takes itself too seriously. It doesn't kind of like have a bit of leniency on that one. It's just way too serious. Never give up giving up. This is a PSA I remember seeing quite a lot. Well, the PSA was released in 2011 from the Australian company Quitline, and it follows a man talking about his experiences with smoking and how he's tried to quit but keeps going back to smoking. At the end of the PSA, it actually ends with an optimistic note where the bloke in the PSA hasn't smoked for over 3 years, and he basically tells the viewer to never give up giving up on smoking, as the more you try it, the better you'll get at it. I really like the approach to this PSA because it's a lot more realistic than other PSAs, and it actually shows people how you will try to quit but can't quit, and that you should just keep on trying because eventually you'll get it right. Train. A 2007 PSA from Ad Cancel in America depicts a man on a track as the train's approaching. The man is talking to the viewer about global warming and how the irreversible consequences are 30 years away. He then goes on to say it won't affect him at all, and as he goes to walk off the tracks, a little girl standing behind him on the tracks says the train's about to run the little girl over. Text comes up saying that there's still time to fight global warming. Every Mother's Worst Nightmare. Every Mother's Worst Nightmare is a 1979 PSA from the UK, which starts off with a scream that sounds like Tom from Tom and Jerry. Is that just me or what? Because it does.
This is...
But anyways, the nightmare the PSA is talking about is a baby knocking over a pram and landing face first into a lady's bag hanging at the end of the pram. The PSA has a narrator talking about ways to avoid this from happening, and I just find it weird that they really needed to make a PSA on how to keep your baby safe in a pram. Like, was it really needed? Were there really that many babies falling out of prams at the time? Trick of the Light. Another PSA from the UK, but this one was released in 1991. The PSA follows a man walking around a neighborhood as some houses have their lights on and some don't. The narrator talks about how this is a game to see which houses have people in them and which don't. There are 3 houses that we have to guess which have people in them and which ones don't. 2 houses don't have lights on, but as we look at one of them, has a light on and it turns off as we look at it. But until we see the third one, it has no lights on. The narrator actually ends the PSA saying that there's actually no one in any of the houses, but if you don't want people to break into your house, make it look like they get actually in your house by leaving a light on. The PSA ends with the campaign slogan, "Crime. Together we'll crack it." Tier 2. A little spooky. Think. This is a British company that was formed in 1946 to try and save more lives when on the road. Think released the first PSA campaign in 1950, which is an animated short telling people how to be safer drivers in many different ways. It's honestly just a simple animated short, but since then, Think has released many PSAs and even made a PSA with Adam West Batman because, yeah, 60s Batman had to be in every late 60s PSA, didn't it? But Think definitely does have their fair share of disturbing PSAs, such as Eyes, Julie, and It's 30 for a Reason. I Helped. I helped as an American PSA that aired during the 2002 Super Bowl. The PSA follows people saying that they helped do horrible things such as murder families in Colombia. After someone says that they helped do something terrible, someone else follows up with things like it was all harmless fun or they were just having fun, etc. The PSA ends the text, drug money supports terror, and that if you buy drugs, you might too. Icons. Icons is a 2006 PSA from the California Department of Public Health, and I've talked about this one about a million times. Basically, the PSA shows the viewer how tobacco companies try to fool people into thinking that smoking's cool. This PSA does this by the setting constantly changing into different scenes and different characters. Each character keeps talking about how tobacco companies try to fool people into smoking, and that the lies they tell people until the last scene shows a man in a wheelchair struggling to talk to the viewer, and that the reality of it is that you can end up like him. And this PSA is probably one of the most well-known PSAs in the 2000s because it's on a lot of DVDs, and like as I mentioned in my childhood trauma video, it's actually in The Dark Knight. Don't worry, be happy. This is a PSA that was released in 1999 from the Australian company Transport Safety. The PSA has the song with the same name of this PSA from Bob Marley, as we get to see cars getting close to being in accidents, and some of them actually in accidents as the accidents get worse and worse throughout the PSA. Some cars even hit pedestrians walking by, and one bloke on a motorbike almost slides into another car until at the end of the PSA, text comes up saying, "Take another look at intersections." Youth Ambassadors KC. This is a company from Kansas City in America trying to help kids that grow up in bad situations. The company's most well-known PSAs are the 3 Lessons from a Neighborhood PSAs. This series of PSAs are all meant to be like Sesame Street, even down to having puppets that look like they were built by the Jim Henson's Creature Shop. All of the 3 PSAs focus on different topics, such as one about kids starving and how to avoid feeling hungry. Another focuses on how to dodge bullets when being shot at, and the last one focuses on dealing with an overdose. The company's also made another series of PSAs called Welcome to My Neighborhood, which talks about the same kinds of topics, but has kids tell their stories as a picture shop, illustrating their stories. Frank. Frank is a British company that made PSAs mostly around 2005 to 2010. Most of their PSAs just talk about how certain drugs are dangerous. The company's mainly known for the Pablo the Mule Dog PSAs, where a dog's stuffed with cocaine and walks around talking to different people, and things whilst the people he talks to are on drugs. Obviously, the Pablo the Mule Dog PSAs are mainly known from John Tron's video, where he talks about the series of PSAs. Before It's Too Late. A PSA from the 2010s made by the Ministry of Health in South Korea tries to show you that you should stop smoking before it's too late to stop smoking. The PSA shows that smoking is difficult when he's a normal guy smoking, and then it shows him in a hospital saying it's going to be harder to quit now. The PSA ends with the text, "Quitting smoking is difficult, but it'll be harder when you don't hang up." Hanna-Barbera Anti-Drug PSA. So this is just a really interesting American PSA from the 1970s from the well-known animation company Hanna-Barbera. The company is responsible for many well-known animated shows like Scooby-Doo, The Flintstones, The Jetsons, and even Tom and Jerry. So yeah, as the title suggests, the company made an anti-drug PSA that follows a man as he gets high on some kind of drug, and then he gets led into his own demise. It's a pretty trippy PSA with the visuals and all, but I do like the animation, it's pretty solid. 20 Seconds. 20 Seconds is a PSA from Australia released in 2011 by the company Play It Safe by the Water. The PSA follows this one-angled shot from the pool's level as a child jumps in the pool and a timer starts. The timer keeps going, and around the 17-second mark, a narrator comes in to say 20 seconds is all it takes for a toddler to drown, and that you should never take your eyes off your children around the water. Randolph. This is a PSA from Switzerland from the company Bureau for Fire Prevention, and was released in 1998. The PSA follows a man talking to the viewer with him in the shadows as he narrates a scenario where his brother grabbed matches from the kitchen whilst the parents weren't watching and accidentally lit the person narrating the PSA's pillow. When he reveals that his brother lit the pillow, he turns around to show his face and to say that his brother didn't find cookies in the kitchen, he found matches. ACC Think Safe NZ campaign. A New Zealand series of PSAs from the early 2000s is a whole campaign around making sure people are safe around their house. All of these PSAs have the same kind of formula where it starts off lighthearted, presenting itself as an advertisement for a fake product, until the main character falls into or off of something, such as falling into a table, falling off a ladder, and falling down the stairs. And I don't want to be that guy, but I kind of find these PSAs funny. It's just so all of a sudden, when you watch these PSAs, it is wild. Parents. Parents is a PSA from the UK that was released in 1976. The PSA follows a group of kids as they're playing with fireworks until they light them and one of the kids burns their face from them. This happens whilst the couple is coming home from the shops as they talk about parenting and being strict on children. The couple get home and the husband ends up asking what their son's doing, and as he talks about it, someone else comes up to tell the wife what happened to the kid. After that, a narrator comes in to say, if your kid was hurt in an accident like this, would you go and blame the other parents? And the narrator goes on to say that your children are your own responsibility. The PSA ends with the narrator telling the viewer to be careful around fireworks. Sandy Hook Promise. This series of PSAs were made after the Sandy Hook school that took place on the 14th of December in 2012. Parents of the victims came together to create the organization to make more people aware about school. Their most well-known PSAs are obviously Back to School Essentials and Evan. In Back to School Essentials, kids talk to the camera about essential items for school until we hear a on the school grounds, as normal school items are used to help students escape or defend themselves. In the Evan PSA, it's focused around a normal school day where a boy ends up talking to a girl by writing on a desk in a library. They finally find out who each other are as a enters the school gym. But the whole point of the PSA is to be aware of the signs that someone might be planning a It doesn't do it that well because the signs they show to the viewer are a bit far-fetched, but not a bad idea for a PSA. They have made quite a few PSAs since their creation in 2012 and still going today. The Spirit of Dark and Lonely Water. This is a piff from 1973 where a hooded figure meant to be the Grim Reaper follows a few kids playing near water as some kids fall in and die. This is until one kid falls in and gets saved by a group of kids nearby, and the message trying to be pushed to children is to be careful around water. By the way, if you didn't know this, the narrator's voice is Donald Pleasance, and he's known for playing Dr. Loomis in the Halloween film series. The original Halloween film series, not like the other two reboots. Truth. An American company based in Florida that was formed in 1998 tries to make people stop smoking. Truth focused more on the youth of America and aimed their PSAs more around them, so they can try and stop them from smoking before they start. This approach that Truth took got extremely obvious when they basically tried to pander to that age group with cringeworthy It's a Trap PSA. The company ended up releasing their first PSA in the year 2000, and Truth actually proved to be effective throughout the 2000s. Their PSAs didn't try and scare the viewer, all they did is tell the viewer what tobacco can do to you. Also, I've made a full video talking about Truth with their history and how they've ended up, so the video will be up in the title card above or link in the description. Grain Drain. This is a UK PSA that was released in 1975. Grain Drain follows a scenario where someone's filling up a grain drain whilst the narrator talks about how they look like sandpits to children. Then we get to see a toy baby thrown into the grain drain as we hear crying sound effects as the toy doll is going under the grain drain. After that, the narrator ends with put a grid on it to avoid children falling in and possibly dying. Human Ball. Human Ball is a Belgian PSA from the Doctors Without Borders. His PSA is an animated short where a man starts rolling after falling over and more people are getting caught in his rolling ball. The ball gets bigger and bigger, going all across the country until it ends with the ball being huge, rolling over heaps of people in the city. Then it eventually cuts to text when we see the woman singing and it's just about to get squashed. Text fades in saying, "Don't let AIDS gain more ground. Everyone must have access to treatment." No Place to Race. An Aussie PSA released in 2009 from Mac of South Australia follows different MotoGP races where riders are falling off their bikes. But this PSA has a twist. As the riders fall off their bikes, they add things like bins, bus stops, and other things you would see on the side of roads outside of the track. After that, the well-known Aussie motorbike racer Mick Doohan comes out to say that if these obstacles on the road were on the track, that he would be dead. Rabies Means Death. Rabies Means Death is a British PSA from the 70s that talks about how dangerous a disease rabies is. Most of the PSA takes place in an airport as we see shots of kids suffering from the disease randomly disrupting the PSA. A narrator comes in about halfway into the PSA, talking about how the outcome of bringing an animal with you on a plane could result in death because of rabies. Just another straightforward PSA with some disturbing imagery with the kids suffering in a hospital. NAC-AIDS. This is an Aussie company that ran a campaign all about AIDS from 1984 to 1988, all about the disease and how it can be easily spread during the epidemic. Their most well-known PSA by far is definitely the bowling PSA of the Grim Reapers bowling people down. The PSA released and a lot of controversy came with it, such as people complaining about how disturbing the PSA is and also how the PSA portrays the LGBT community. People claim that the PSA was provoking fear and hostility towards members of Australia's LGBT community and that the Grim Reapers represented gay men. Controversy aside, the creator of this PSA, Simone Reynolds, just randomly thought one day, you know what? I'm going to put bowling in my PSA. And that's how it ended up being about bowling. The bowling PSA alone cost the company around 300,000 Australian dollars back in the late 80s. And also they actually made the bowling ball, like it's a 7-foot tall bowling ball. And for the ball not to crush the cast members, they were advised to fall to the side. NACAIDS did release another PSA that is less well known, with a couple playing Russian roulette as a metaphor for having sex without a condom and rolling a dice to see if you get HIV. Picture. Picture is a PSA released in 1990 from the British company Motor Neuron Disease Association. The PSA shows us a picture of a man suffering from the disease as he talks to the viewer about the disease. He basically says to the viewer that the disease eats away at his muscles and he's slowly dying because of it, and he also hopes that there's hope for other people with the disease. The PSA is pretty simple but damn effective. Clunk Click. A series of British PSAs is a campaign telling people to buckle up. The PSAs usually show some kind of car accident where people will go through the windshield or something else. 3 PSAs I could find under this campaign all cover the same topic of buckling up, as you shouldn't take the risk. They're pretty simple, straightforward PSAs. I don't know what else to say about these. Sette drogi te spengi. This anti-drug campaign from Italy, trying to get people not to do drugs, is very odd. There are only 3 different PSAs which all follow the same premise. All these PSAs have someone's head spinning around in a circle until their head spins back and their eyes are completely white. What is this, some creepypasta? I will never understand how this PSA is not meant to make people do drugs. Like, what's the connection here? Do drugs make your eyes white? Bump in the Road. Bump in the Road is a Greek PSA that was released in 2004 from the company St. Francis of Assisi Animal Shelter. The PSA shows cars driving on the road and going over a bump. The camera slowly pans down to the road to see it's a stuffed toy animal that's meant to represent a dead animal. The PSA ends with the text, "You abandoned your dog and you condemned it to death a number of times. Enjoy your holiday." The number keeps going up every 2 numbers every second, as at the bottom left of the screen since the start of the PSA, the number was going up at a similar pace. I don't know if it's just me, but I find this PSA to be quite strange and it doesn't make that much sense. Embro. This was a really bizarre PSA from the Ministry of Transport in the Czech Republic from 2008. In this PSA we follow a really weird looking fetus in which we see it react to the woman's partner's speeding. The fetus is swinging back and forth in the womb until it gets flipped around and dies because the couple got into a car accident. Then text fades in saying do not decide about life other than their aggressive driving. The fetus just looks terrible and it's the most disturbing part of this PSA. Also, I think this PSA does have some pretty broken English, so it's hard to understand. Brazilian Partnership Against Drugs. A series of PSAs from Brazil that are out to tell people not to do drugs like every other anti-drug company. In one PSA called Rewind, the events of gun go in reverse, where a woman got shot in the head in her car and it goes back to see where the perpetrator got the gun, and it follows how he got that money to get a gun came from selling drugs. The PSA is trying to say that if you are buying drugs, you're also funding illegal gun trading. In another PSA called Simon, it focuses on a Simon Says game which someone's playing, and it fails on the 2nd level. Text fades in to say marijuana almost inoffensive. Because yeah, marijuana turns you into a literal sloth. Yeah, don't even remind me about that, that's Sona Sloth PSA. In the last PSA I'll mention, called Board Game, 3 kids are playing a game where the punishments they get in the game seem to be serious things like stealing cars and stealing from your mother. It ends with one of the kids in the game getting an overdose card, so they're out of the game. Sneak in that little anti-drug message in the end of the PSA with that last board piece being about drugs. You know, if you didn't have that in this video, you wouldn't know what it's about. But yeah, this PSA is meant to be a metaphor for life, and it's pretty obvious what it's meant to be representing. Apaches. Apaches is a 1977 public information film that was mostly shown around schools to tell kids to be safe when playing. Throughout the PSA, we see kids playing cowboys and Indians, and as the kids get killed one by one in different areas of a farm. Kim's run over by a tractor she was standing on, Tom drowns in a slurry pit, Sharon dies from accidentally drinking chemicals while pretending it was alcohol, Robert gets crushed by a falling gate marked accident in October, and lastly Danny crashes the tractor he was riding onto a ditch. Danny continues his narration after his death, and talks calmly about how his family's all arriving for a party being prepared earlier in the film. After that, text comes up with all the different kids that died on farms in the year Apaches was made. And this is probably one of the most well-known public information films of all time. Burnt Memories. A PSA from the London Fire Brigade that was released in 1994 follows a point of view shot of someone walking through a burnt down house. Whilst this is happening, we hear a priest talking at a funeral for 2 kids that died in a house fire. After that, a narrator comes in to say 8 out of 10 times a house fire starts by someone who lives there, and that you shouldn't let a fire be your own fault. Lucy. This is an Aussie PSA that was released in 2008 from the company Animals Australia, and the PSA follows a pig talking to the viewer with the young girl's voice. The pig talks about how she hates being where she is and that she gets so hot and cold, and that now because she's so big she can barely even stand. They keep on talking about how bad of a situation they're in by mentioning that they have massive sores on them and that they have a sore stomach. A narrator comes in to say that it's believed that a pig has the intelligence of a 3-year-old child, and that you should help them end the practices of Australia's pork industry. I imagine this PSA actually works, as from a little bit of research about the topic and the treatment of animals, it has actually apparently gotten a lot better over the years, with companies like RSPCA stepping in to make sure animals are being treated better. Amnesty International PSAs. Amnesty International PSAs are just extremely strange. One of their PSAs follows a bunch of leaders blowing, such as Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-il, and a few others. The end of the PSA shows a lit candle as the fire moves a little but doesn't blow out the candle. Another PSA shows a man putting together a pencil like it's a gun, with the PSA ending with the text, "Your signature is our weapon." And in the last one I'll mention, it's a PSA that's framed like one of those TV shows that try to sell items to their viewers. Instead of selling the typical stuff they'll sell on their shows, they end up telling the viewer that they're selling 10,000 AK-47s for the price of £474.99. Throughout the PSA, we see units sold go up to 9,237, and text fades in to say the arms trade's out of control. The company has way too many PSAs worldwide, but I'd be here for a million years if I talked about all of them. And also, I've actually started seeing their PSAs pop up more recently. Scavengers. This is a PSA released in 1987 from the UK company Lynx. It follows a fly flying around the city until it gets into a room with a bunch of rich people, where we keep switching back and forth from the fly's perspective to the rich people. We see the fly nibble on something until a rich couple pulls back a fur coat, as we see a bunch of guts underneath the coat with heaps of flies on it, as well as maggots. The PSA ends with the text saying, "When animals are killed for their fur, 2 kinds of scavengers move in. The difference is flies don't know any better." So this PSA is always on people's most scariest PSAs and whatnot, but I really don't see it, because to me it's really dated and campy, and I don't really see how people can get scared of this. Alice Gun Safety PSA. A PSA from the Brady campaign in America follows Alice and the White Rabbit as they're walking down a hallway. Alice stops and walks into one of the rooms. She wanders around the room until she sees the shelf. Alice goes over to the shelf and finds a cabinet. She's curious about what's in the cabinet, so she grabs out what's in the cabinet, and it's a gun. As Alice grabs the gun, narration starts by saying only 1/3 of American households have a gun. When the narrator says this, Alice accidentally shoots herself in the head. The narrator asks the viewer to ask their neighbor if there's a gun where they play, as we see the White Rabbit in shock. I don't get it why they're asking the viewer to ask their neighbor, like why wouldn't they ask their parents if they have a gun in their own house? ISPCC. This is an Irish company that was formed back in 1956. The company has made quite a few PSAs about cruelty towards children, as the company is out to try and prevent that issue. I can mainly find PSAs from the company throughout the 2000s and 2010s, as they all cover the same kind of issue, which is cruelty towards children, and that they should have access to try and help those in need. Beach Babes. Beach Babes is a 2003 PSA from WaterSafe Auckland in New Zealand. The PSA is all about watching your children around water, as we follow these women setting up to lay down in the sand. The women keep setting up to get ready to relax on the beach, but one hidden detail is that the child is on the raft in the background and he falls into the water about halfway through this PSA. Text fades in, then telling the viewer to watch your kids or watch them drown. Boy. A 2015 PSA from the company Nationwide follows a boy. Kind of a no-brainer, in where he's experiencing things such as riding a Green Machine ripoff and sailing the ocean with your dog. The boy narrates his PSA saying that he'll never be able to do those things until at the end of the PSA the boy tells us that he couldn't grow up because he died from an accident. Text shows up saying that the number one cause of childhood deaths is preventable accidents, and a narrator comes in to say Nationwide believes in protecting what matters most, you kids. Ripley's believe it or not, but this PSA was really controversial at the time. Well, it didn't help that this aired during the Super Bowl, and also that this company is known for making ads trying to sell their insurance. But the company did eventually come out and said that all they wanted to do was start a conversation and not actually sell anything to the viewer, so this counts as a PSA. Children see, children do. This 2013 PSA made by the company Napcan in Australia follows different scenarios where children are copying their parents. There are a few different scenarios, such as a mother smoking and the child doing the same, a mother yelling at another driver, and a woman throwing up on the side of the street. PSA starts to get to the point where parents are being verbally or physically abusive and their children are copying them. The PSA ends with the text, children see, children do. Obviously the PSA is trying to tell the viewer that parents set the example, so you gotta set the right example to your children. Chopper. Chopper's a PSA featuring the convicted Aussie criminal Mark Brandon Reed, or as he's known, Chopper, talking to the viewer. The PSA was released in 2001 from the company Pedestrian Council of Australia, and Chopper's talking about killing. Well, to be more accurate, he's talking about how you are no different to him if you kill someone while drink driving. There are about 2 or 3 of these PSAs, but they all follow the same format where Chopper's sitting at a table talking to the viewer. Real tracks, real life, real trains. This is a British PSA that was released in 2016 from the company British Transport Police, and it shows us real footage of people around trains. As the PSA goes on, more and more disturbing imagery shows up with quite a few close calls, and even one scenario where someone got squashed and pushed underneath the train. This PSA wouldn't be that disturbing at all if it wasn't for the last scenario where we get to see someone die by a train. Computer. A 2006 PSA from the company DVLA in the UK shows a man going back home from work. It starts with him getting into his car as we follow his journey home, and the whole PSA is shot like a horror movie with a mysterious black rectangle following him. Or you know, it might be like 2001 A Space Odyssey. The man finally gets home and parks his car in his garage. We see the black rectangle at the back of his car. Text fades in saying you can't escape the computer, which is meant to tell people to pay their registration. I really just asked the question, why would you make a PSA about this? Like, is it really that big of an issue in the UK where you really need to make this? Chainsaw. Chainsaw is yet another UK PSA that was released in 1990 from the company Elefriends. The PSA shows a man with a chainsaw cutting up lots of stuffed toys with random sound effects in the background. After that, text comes up saying in Africa they use it to chop down elephants. I literally wouldn't have known what this PSA was about if it wasn't for that text at the end of the PSA. Because besides from that, it's just someone chopping up like toy animals. Everybody knows. This is a PSA from the company Quitline in Australia, released in 2008. The whole PSA is actually a compilation of clips from their own company's clips to other companies' clips that they hopefully got the rights to use, but who knows. When this PSA is playing, the song Everybody Knows from Leonard Cohen is playing over the images we see in the PSA. All we see in this PSA is different things that people suffer with after smoking for a long time. And text comes up throughout the PSA when we see different images telling us exactly what's what. And also a bit later in the PSA, more text comes up saying everybody knows that smoking causes all these diseases, but you still smoke. Focus on the positive. Yet another anti-smoking PSA. Focus on the Positive is a PSA released in 2002 from the American government of Florida as it follows a group of young people walking into a building of a tobacco company. The teens ask the question, why don't you tell people that there's arsenic in cigarette smoke? After one of these teens asks the question, one of the men working for the company starts breaking into song about focusing on the positive. Everyone starts to dance and sing along as they talk about how people have to be so derogatory towards the big tobacco companies. I'm gonna be honest, the song is really catchy. Not a big fan of the PSA itself, but the song just gets in your head and it will not get out. But throughout the song they talk about the negative effects of smoking, and as the teens talk about it, the company just brushes it off and says to just stay focused on the positive. The song finally ends and one of the workers for the tobacco company calls security to escort the teens out of the building. Open Your Eyes. Open Your Eyes is a UK PSA that was released in 1998 from the company Respect for Animals. Firstly, we see a woman walking down a hallway in a shop, and then it cuts to a man in a plain hallway. The whole PSA just cuts back and forth from a woman in a shop to a man in a random building that's meant to be a slaughterhouse. So the PSA shows a woman buying a leather jacket, and it shows a man in the slaughterhouse killing animals to get the fur that were meant to connect the dots that he's doing it for the jacket. They even compare things like swiping a credit card to pay for a jacket to a man cutting open an animal. Wild. The PSA ends with the text, fur looks great until you open your eyes. Hansel and Gretel. This 2002 PSA made by the company Sheena's Place from Canada follows the two fairy tale characters as we see the witch's house that is made of candy. They start to eat the house, and while doing so, Gretel thinks about what her parents told her about eating too much. Text shows up saying how your child feels about their body is up to you. We then follow Hansel as we can hear Gretel throw out the food she decided. The PSA ends with let's stop eating disorders before they start. Hooked. Hooked is a 2007 PSA from the company NHS in the UK showing how addictive smoking can be. The PSA starts with an office worker on the phone as he's about to hang up. He hangs up the phone and seems to have an urge to do something, but as that's happening he gets hooked in the mouth like a fish. The man gets reeled outside, being pulled on the ground by the fish hook, so literally being reeled outside to go and have a smoke. It ends with the man smoking outside as the narrator says the average smoker needs over 5,000 cigarettes a year and that you should get unhooked. Don't play. This is a French PSA from the company Massif that was released in 2006. I probably butchered that pronunciation, sorry. The PSA follows a few different ages of people sitting around a table playing Russian roulette. They all take their turn at pulling the trigger on themselves until it gets to Grandma. The Grandma, instead of aiming the gun at herself, she aims it at a girl and shoots the girl. It then cuts to what really happened, and what happened is the Grandma caused an accident and accidentally hit the same child she shot before. Text in French comes up, which roughly translates to "don't play anymore." Midas. A 2007 PSA from the company TAWAFS in the UK shows a burnt up man with flames coming off his head as he's talking to the viewer about how he loves people and he loves to be around them. He then talks about how he's drawn to certain things that he can't help himself, and he also introduces himself as Fire about 20 seconds into this PSA. The PSA ends with Fire telling us to be careful near him as he can't help himself. Monster Hallway. This is a Canadian PSA released in 2010 from the company Kids Help Phone. The PSA follows a kid at his locker. As he closes his locker, we see a puppet that looks like him staring at him. That's until the puppet starts laughing at him because he failed a test. The puppet then starts to change into more of a monster whilst making fun of the child, calling him a tool and telling him to drop out. Finally, the puppet turns into a massive monster that tells the child that Dad would love it if he dropped out and that he would get kicked out of the house if he did. After the puppet calls the kid a joke, the text "got a problem that won't shut up" shows up. Smurfs. Smurfs is a 2005 UNICEF PSA from Belgium that was actually approved by the Smurfs creator Peyo's family. The PSA centers around Smurf Village getting bombed and the whole village turning into a war zone. This PSA didn't air until after 9 PM to avoid children seeing this PSA, as it would be quite disturbing to get your childhood ruined by a PSA. Couldn't imagine that happening. There isn't too much else to say about this PSA, but to be completely honest, what you get at face value is kind of what this PSA is. Barnardos. A company from the UK is known for making PSAs all about how some children need help. This company is mostly known for 2 PSAs called Break the Cycle and Life Story. Break the Cycle follows the cycle of a woman that goes through a then drug then ends up at people for money and ends up in custody. This PSA is telling us that we need to try and help stop the cycle for thousands of kids, as the cycle will only continue if we don't do something to help. In the PSA called Life Story, the PSA shows the life story of a man called Michael, as the PSA keeps going back in time showing what he went through in the past before he got better. The PSA is meant to tell people that people's lives don't have to end like how it began. Peter. Yes, it is that Peter. It is the one you're thinking of. They actually made PSAs, yes. But besides from making knockoff Flash games online for the purpose of saying every game is about animal, they've made quite a few PSAs. By the way, they aren't good. But the company has made PSAs since the early 2000s about animal cruelty, and I think the company's most well-known PSA would have to be Silent Scream, where they compare things like an elderly woman being mugged and getting bashed, and a father their partner to a dead fish. Also, only 1.7k likes on a video with over 250,000 views. That's not a good sign. But as the company goes, I don't think anyone likes Peter, and they still make PSAs here, and they aren't good at all. Carousel. This PSA released in 2001 from the company Center of Rigor Anti-Drug Control in Latvia, of all countries. Well, this PSA follows a group of people as they're walking around and having fun with each other. The group ends up at a carousel and they go on the ride. Everything seems normal and dandy as they're enjoying the carousel, and then people start to slowly panic and then they eventually all die on the ride. Text comes in to say words like drugs and addiction, and the last bit of text that comes up says choose life. Stroke PSAs. So this is yet another series of PSAs from Ad Cancel in the US, but these PSAs released in 2004. All the PSAs have some celebrity, if it's Michael Clark Duncan, Don Rickles or Sharon Stone, and they all play the part of being the physical embodiment of a stroke. They all talk about how no one likes them and how they like to attack people no matter who they are, where they come from, or anything like that because they're a stroke. In all of the PSAs, each actor makes strokes look really threatening with the way they're talking and acting to the viewer. Casualty. Scottish PSA from Scottish Executive that was released in 2001 follows a scenario where a bar is set up in a hospital, as we see people in hospital after accidents, and even a sign that says happy hour 5 to 8 PM. What the fuck? But after that it goes back to the bar in the hospital where we see a blood vial next to the bottles of alcohol where the text binge drinking everyone's paying up shows up. I honestly just don't understand this one at all. I really don't. Fight Back. Fight Back is a PSA from the company EIA released in 1995, and the whole PSA follows a monkey as it seems to be stressing out about how people treat animals. We see flashing images and videos of animals that have been hurt by people or hunted by people as the monkey starts to freak out more and more. It finally gets to the point where the monkey's completely freaking out as it flashes back and forth until we see the monkey get a gun and the text comes up saying help wildlife fight back comes up. Also, the music in the background of this PSA is the song Burn from 9 Inch Nails. Egg. This is a PSA from the WRAA in New Zealand that was released in 2003, as it follows a woman's face on an egg. The woman talks about her experience with the she had to deal with when she was with one of her partners. She talks about how she was woken up at 2 AM and dragged into her kitchen to be yelled at about how she cooked his eggs. After that, she talks about how she got kicked in the stomach and hit with a baseball bat, and text comes up saying that she was 7 months pregnant when that happened. Just depressing, that's all I can say. Have a smoke. The PSA from the Ministry of Health in Poland that was released in the year 1999 follows someone as they light a match to have a cigarette. But the PSA then transitions to a lit candle above a grave as we see the text come in say have a smoke. Just a really simple PSA and there's nothing really to say about it. It's pretty short, pretty straightforward, that's really it. Maggots. A 1996 PSA from the Arizona Department of Health Services is meant to show us how gross it is to smoke. The PSA does this by juxtaposing a lady in the bathroom with a grey girl with maggots in her teeth smoking and spitting out maggots into the sink whilst playful music's playing in the background. And it does this throughout the whole PSA, obviously trying to show how bad smoking is and how disgusting you look. Play Safe. Play Safe is a public information film from the UK made in 1978. It's a 10.5 minute long public information film and it's all about how kids should be playing safe, and the PSA shows examples of kids playing near dangerous areas such as power lines and electric substations. We get to see examples of kids hurting themselves by playing near those areas, such as a boy with his kite hitting a power line and kids trying to retrieve a frisbee from an electric substation. Save Ralph. This is a PSA released in 2021 made by the Humane Society of the United States, follows the daily life of a rabbit, voiced by Taika Waititi, that constantly gets put into testing facilities to test new products on. Also there's a background voice that's meant to be like a director or something like that for the video, which is actually voiced by Ricky Gervais. Ralph the Rabbit is talking to the audience in an interview style, talking about how he lives his life, and he talks about different things to do with animal testing and how rabbits die getting tested on. We eventually see Ralph get tested on, as other rabbits in the facility are aware of the camera crew and are begging to be saved. By the way, the male voice actor is Zac Efron. The PSA ends with the text saying that no animal should suffer and die in the name of beauty. Make It Home for Christmas. Make It Home for Christmas is a PSA from the FIA Foundation in the UK that was released in 2017. The PSA follows a man and a daughter texting, and the daughter is excited for her father to come home by Christmas. But the dad is texting her whilst driving and ends up dying because he got into an accident whilst texting, and the daughter finds out and starts crying. The PSA ends with a photo of the two in front of the tree whilst text Make It Home for Christmas comes up. Superhero. A very bizarre PSA from the UK by the company NHS that was released in 2006 that follows a party where someone accidentally lets go of the balloons. A superhero comes up to retrieve the balloons that are stuck in a construction site about 4 floors up. The superhero climbs up and pulls off some sick maneuvers, until he's just a little further than arm's reach away from the balloons as he slips and falls to his death. A narrator comes in saying too much alcohol makes you feel invincible when you are most vulnerable. Network Rail. This is yet another UK PSA following the story of a man named Nathan where he got an electric shock from a train cable. He was mucking around the train tracks with the cable, where he was going to throw the cable to a friend but ended up getting a deadly amount of electricity through his system where he sees him struggling to live on the ground. We then see that we had a friend with him that died instantly, but Nathan ended up surviving that situation as he said that 25,000 volts went through his body and that he was lucky to survive. Tar. Tar is a 2006 PSA from the company VUKA in South Africa, where an older woman is getting ready for something in a bathroom. She then randomly coughs out some black substance, and after that it gets worse and worse as she starts throwing up in the sink. This happens whilst the song The Dress Looks Nice and New from Sir John Stevens plays in the background. More and more black liquid keeps coming out until it finally stops. Text comes up saying 20 a day, 40 years, 3.4 kilos of tar. Enjoy. Yeti. This is a 2009 PSA from the company Landsar in New Zealand, and it follows a man that's almost dead in some mountains until a Yeti comes and saves him. The Yeti takes him out of his situation and walks through all the hills to a campfire where the Yeti tells him that there's no such thing as Yetis. We then cut back to him still being in the tree where he was dreaming about Yeti saving him and he was stuck in the tree and almost dead, and then we see the text saying in reality we're on your way out, and then it comes up with the company's logo. Toys That Kill. A 2004 PSA from the company Mothers Against Guns in the UK follows a few younger and older kids that are playing with BB guns in a forest. They're playing around with the guns and they seem to be having fun except for one kid waiting behind some cover. His younger sister comes up asking if she can play with them and the young boy kind of brushes her off, and then one of the other kids comes and shoots the boy in the head with a BB gun. But the twist of this PSA is that it was a real gun, and the narrator comes in and says that BB guns are turning into real guns as we see other kids dead in the forest. Venomosity. A wild series of PSAs that was released in 2011 from the Arizona Department of Health in America. But one of them follows a classroom where a person's tempted to go and have a smoke, and as they're tempted, a weird looking venom tentacle comes out of them. The tentacle then goes and drags them outside to have a cigarette, and the text "Cravings brought to you by addiction" comes up. Another one shows the insides of someone smoking, as we hear a narrator meant to be Venom talking to the viewer about how it's feeding time, and that the more you give him, the stronger he gets, obviously meaning the more you smoke, the stronger it gets. After that, zooms out to see him smoking in a shed, and text "Confinement brought to you by addiction" comes up. Also, I want to mention that the website does not work anymore, unfortunately. Welcome to the battery. This is a 1988 PSA from the company Compassion in World Farming, or CIWF for short, in the UK. This PSA is following a man talking to the viewer with a black background. He's talking about how you are being put in a certain system, as he mentions cages and lanes, and that they're made for your safety. He then talks about how people are going to remove your teeth and nails, as it reduces the possibility of cannibalism, and that it's in your interest to comply. The man tells us that this whole system is completely legal, and that you are part of one of the most cost-effective systems, and that you should have no worries. We then see that chickens are being put into this system, and then this is happening with your approval. The PSA then ends with the line, "Welcome to the battery." Tier 3. Disturbing. Montana Meth Project. Montana Meth Project is a well-known anti-meth organization started in 1999. The company released a lot of anti-meth PSAs throughout the 2000s, and overall they made a lot of PSAs. Montana Meth Project's PSAs were actually shown to be quite effective when they started showing more the disgusting things that meth does to you instead of just trying to scare kids. The company does have some great PSAs, such as Ben, Deep End, and Jessica, but they have some very strange PSAs like everything else, which is the only PSA to have a corn song in it from what I can find. WSIB/prevented.ca. A Canadian organisation that focuses around making PSAs about being safe in the workplace, with their most well-known PSA definitely being Top Chef. WSIB made most of their PSA in 2007, but they did release one PSA in 2009. Besides from those 7 PSAs, the company has not made any others. It's quite strange to see a company with barely many PSAs at all still being remembered. I guess they're mainly remembered for their Top Chef PSA. Can You Hear Me? Can You Hear Me is a 90s PSA from the UK made by the company Safety on the Move. It follows a scenario where someone's lying in a hospital bed with people around the bed looking at them and talking about what happened before and what has happened to the person in the bed. One of the people standing talking to the person in the hospital bed admits that it's their fault and begs for the victim's forgiveness. Heaven Can Wait. This 2002 PSA from the company Axion in Belgium centers around a few guys in a car crash that crashed into a tree. All the people in the car seem to be dead until we see the spirits of all the people start to rise. Their spirits go to the sky, except for the passenger that kept his seatbelt on because his spirit goes back into his body. After his spirit is back, he wakes up to his friends dead in the car. PSA ends with the text "Heaven Can Wait," belts up. Jacqueline. Jacqueline is a PSA released by the Texas Department of Transport in 2004. The PSA shows a woman holding up an old picture of herself before she got into a car accident caused by a drunk driver. She explains how she ended up in that situation and what happened to her until near the end of the PSA she pulls down the photo to show what she looks like now after the accident. This is more of a depressing PSA than it actually being scary, as it's sad to see someone that had to go through so much. Jacqueline got into the accident back in 1999, and after that accident she had this PSA air in 2004 and also made an appearance on Oprah in 60 Minutes. Unfortunately, she died of cancer on the 20th of April in 2019. RSPCA. British company that's released some PSAs over time was made to try and help animals find homes and get out of dangerous households. This company was founded all the way back in 1824, almost 200 years ago, but they started making PSAs around the late 80s, all the way up till about the late 2010s. Their most well-known PSAs are definitely How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, My Little Puppy, and Yard. The first 2 PSAs I mentioned are known for being absolutely insane. I do want to mention that the RSPCA is one of those companies where they have one country's version and then another country's version, which it's still the same company, like RSPCA in Australia versus RSPCA in the UK. The UK RSPCA PSAs mostly try to scare the viewer or shock them without giving the viewer much information about what the company is trying to do or how to help animals in need. RSPCA in Australia, on the other hand, has only made one disturbing PSA, but the rest of their PSAs actually is just light-hearted PSAs that try to inform the viewer that animals need your help, or they actually try to inform the viewer on how you can help those animals and educate them. Lost Dreams. Lost Dreams is a 2001 PSA from the Australian government of all people. But this PSA follows a few different scenarios of people using drugs whilst their younger selves narrate the PSA, seeing what they want to be when they're older. We start the PSA with the same woman being used, a man looking through someone's wallet they stole in the bathroom, a woman abusing their mother, and a boy that's being zipped up in a body bag. Text fades in saying, "Drugs destroy lives, let's work together against drugs." Fire Kills. Fire Kills is a British company that started in 1988, and they mostly try to warn people about the dangers of fire and how dangerous house fires can be. The company has made some well-known PSAs such as Victim, Night Vision, which I'll also mention later, and On Your Child's Life. They've made some absolutely great PSAs that are very well done, such as the ones I mentioned before, but they do have some of their very weird PSAs, such as Pull Your Finger Out. The Pull Your Finger Out PSA is just the most British thing possible, but not in a good way. I really just find that I can't take this seriously, and also, if I'm trying to think that this is funny, I don't think it's funny. Operation Trident. This is a metropolitan police unit in the UK set up in 1998 to tackle mostly gun crime. They've released a few PSAs around 2005 tackling gun crime, such as people not telling the authorities when knowing that someone has a gun, imprisonment because of gun crime, and being charged for gun possession. Danish Road Safety Council. A company from Denmark basically is out to try and prevent car crashes, released two PSAs in 2003 that both follow the same premise. The two PSAs have car crashes going on in reverse, so they start off with the crash itself and rewind as all of the damage of the accident goes away. One of them has a collision with another car, whilst the other has a bloke that hit a bike rider. Both PSAs have the person who caused the accident talking about how they wish they could reverse time, and that the accident never happened, tying into what we're seeing visually. Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Mothers Against Drunk Driving is an organisation that's trying to stop people from drunk driving. The company started back in 1980 after a mother lost her 13-year-old daughter to a drunk driver from a hit-and-run incident. It's honestly really sad that some companies are made after tragedies have happened. Like with a lot of these PSA companies, it is because some kind of tragedy, like say one of their family relatives or even like their own sons or daughters would get hit by a car or something like that, or had something serious happen to them. The company released some PSAs throughout the 90s and 2000s telling people that they shouldn't be drunk driving by showing them what could happen if you do it. NSPCC. This company is a British company that's out to protect children from any kinds of dangers. NSPCC started making PSAs around the 90s, which are mostly about child abuse and child sexual abuse, and still make PSAs to this day. Some of the most well-known PSAs are Cartoon, Can't Look, Excuses, and I Saw You Willie. I'll talk about some of their more disturbing PSAs later on this iceberg, as they deserve their own spot in this iceberg because some of their PSAs aren't really disturbing at all, and then some are very, very disturbing. I honestly can't think of one bad NSPCC PSA because they're all well done and deliver their message across to the viewer very well. Speed. An Aussie PSA released in 2005 from the Australian government follows a few different people as they try the drug speed. In different people, they show the extreme reactions of people using the drug and how it affects people. We see one girl crack it at her friends and a guy punch a hole in her door. After that, we get to see a shot of a bloke in his house making drugs as they put a bunch of random stuff in it, and the PSA ends with a girl in a hospital bed saying that they didn't know what was in it. Finally, the text, "Speed you don't know what will do to you," comes up at the end, which was actually a campaign run by the Australian government at this time. I'm pretty sure there are a few of these, but I could only find this one. Phone Line. Phone Line is a PSA made by the company Samaritans in 1991 from the UK. This PSA is an animated PSA playing out different stressful scenarios that someone's going through, such as a divorce. There are many different voices coming in the PSA, adding on top of each other to make the situation seem more stressful. This keeps on going until the main character we're meant to be following starts to scream from all the stress. Also, the visuals in this PSA are actually really cool and interesting and keep me quite engaged with the PSA. The text "we understand" shows up to say to the viewer that the Samaritans understand the kind of stress that you may be going through at the time, and that the Samaritans are there for you. Dancing Bears. This is a PSA from the UK released sometime in the 2000s from the company WSPA, which stands for the World Society for the Protection of Animals. They made a PSA that's basically a glorified saw flick, but instead of a saw trap, there's a man cutting different parts of a wooden bear, showing what people actually do to bears, such as drilling through their noses and cutting off their nails. After that's done, there's a string in the wooden bear's nose that the man pulls to make the wooden bear dance, as the narrator says captivity, torture, or dance until death. The WSPA is here to protect animals. Honestly, this PSA is in such low quality that it's hard to really see what's actually going on in this one. DOE. An Irish company that makes PSAs about the dangers of driving, if it is drink driving, speeding, or anything else. The company's most famous PSA by far is the Shame on You PSA, which, in my own opinion, it's probably one of the funniest PSAs of all time. It's so ridiculous and taking itself too seriously that it's just funny. Shame on You is meant to be disturbing, but the end of the PSA is just straight up hilarious for how fake and far-fetched it is. But the company has released some good PSAs like Shame. Biggie Bear PSAs. Biggie Bear is a series of PSAs in 2004 from South Africa made by the company Parents for Responsible Viewing. The company shows the viewer different acts that shouldn't be shown to kids on television, which ties into their slogan for this campaign, "What is your child learning from television?" Which I just found out recently that Biggie Bear is played by a well-known South African actor named Rob Van Vern. Biggie Bear's surprise shows us Biggie Bear trying to cheer up one of his friends, Mr. Spotty, by injecting him with some kind of drugs into his arm. Biggie Bear says hello follows a new character called Mr. Rabbit as he comes in to say hi to the kids. Biggie Bear doesn't like that someone besides him is getting the attention, so he ends up beating and killing Mr. Rabbit by shooting him. The last PSA the company made was called Biggie Bear Meets a Friend, and it shows Biggie Bear meeting a new person called Miss Pussycat. After we see the new character, Biggie Bear ends up talking to her for a bit, and after that, Biggie Bear ends up grabbing her and raping her. Shoeboxes. A PSA from the company Africa Rwanda Relief Appeal in 1995. In this PSA, we see footage of African children walking around or upset, as the PSA tells us we know that you hate giving money, so please send us your old shoeboxes. After that's said, we see dead people all over the ground, and more text fades in saying we're running out of coffins. The main reason why this PSA isn't higher on this iceberg is that I don't actually find it that disturbing. Sure, the dead bodies is disturbing, but that's kind of it. Grotesque. Grotesque is a PSA from the Ministry of Transport in the Czech Republic, released in 2008, and it follows a group of friends packing their things into a car after staying near a lake for a while. Circus-style music's playing in the background as they pack their things into the car, whilst they're sped up. They manage to pack everything in the car, but they're all squished in the car. The man in the driver's seat decides to turn on the car, and when he does that, he looks back to see everyone besides him dead in the car. The music slows down a lot, and the narrator comes in to say this is no joke, and that 2 to 3 die or hundreds injured daily, and it mainly happens from obscuring the driver's view or squishing into a vehicle. Sunday lunch. This fucking strange 2006 PSA made by the Southwark Council shows a family having lunch at a table. Everything seems alright and all good, until the mother pulls out a gun and shoots the youngest son in the head. The whole family's horrified and you can hear them all crying, and one of them even throws up after seeing the youngest son dead at the table. Text fades in when you can hear the family crying, saying if you keep quiet about gun crime, it's like pulling the trigger yourself. Just another PSA that tries to intentionally scare the viewer. There's not really much else to say. ECPAT. ECPAT is a company trying to end sexual exploitation of children. The company has a few PSAs such as child sexual exploitation as a crime, in where we follow a few different girls that are being exploited for sex as their ages come up next to them. The PSA ends with an underage girl naked in bed as the authorities storm the building. A picture of a man shows up on screen as the text 10 years covers his face. More text then comes up saying sexual relations with a minor means prison, and then lists off a few names of people that got prison time for this reason. Another PSA, which is actually from Australia, follows a man talking to his wife about how he'll be home soon, and it all seems normal until we see the camera slowly pan back and we see an underage girl sitting on the bed with him. Consumer Safety Institute. A company from the Netherlands that made PSAs about several different topics. Some of the most well-known PSAs are Stadium Fire, Eye Candy, and Rocket. Stadium Fire shows a real stadium fire next to a lit cigarette to show the viewer how the speed of fire is unpredictable and that you should always be prepared. Eye Candy is a PSA where the creators make inedible things look like delicious foods, such as mothballs with bleach and shoe polish with firelighters. The message of Eye Candy is that inedible things can look like food to children and that they should be kept away from those things. In the Rocket PSA, a kid's lighting up fireworks as the narrator's talking about what the characters are doing. The narrator then ends up asking the question, what are you doing wrong? And when that happens, the rocket falls over and hits the girl. Text comes in to say secure bottles by filling them with sand or water, and that windy weather conditions increase accident rates by 48%. Landmine. So this PSA really doesn't have any info of when it was released, but it was made by the United Nations. The PSA takes place at a local girls' soccer game where the girls play, and eventually a few people playing the game are blown up by landmines. Obviously, everyone's panicking and people are starting to blow up from the landmines. As we hear them panicking, text comes up saying if there were landmines here, would you stand for them anywhere? Luke Starler. This PSA is about a man that is suffering with AIDS as we see him trying to get out of bed as he's struggling. We see that he has stage 9 AIDS and it takes him a whole PSA just to get out of bed, and we see and hear how much pain he is just trying to get up. The PSA ends with a text and you think it's hard to get out of bed to get a condom. Action Man. Action Man's a PSA made by the Veterans for Peace, or VFP for short, in the UK, talking about how people after war usually need help but end up doing any substance to deal with the PTSD they get from war. The whole PSA is framed to be a parody of the old G.I. Joe toy commercials that they actually imitate really well. There's a few of these PSAs, with one centering around a man that abuses substances and eventually hangs himself, another about a paraplegic in a wheelchair that shows how he has to deal with life after war, and another about a dead action man figure that you have to take care of, identify who the doll was, and eventually bury and actually set up a funeral for. St. John Ambulance. A company from the UK that's actually made quite a few PSAs over the years, and they're also around in Australia, so there are UK and Australian St. John's PSAs. All the PSAs encourage people to learn first aid in case of an accident or any kind of scenario where someone gets severely injured. The most well-known one is Save the Boy, where a man and his son are out and the son falls off a tree, and the wife knows first aid but she's actually at home and she doesn't know that this has happened. I actually saw a St. John's PSA on TV recently, but it was about someone that drowned in a river and their group of friends were there with them but didn't know first aid, so they encouraged the viewer to learn first aid. By the way, did you know that the creators of Don't Hug Me I'm Scared, Becky Sloan and Joseph Pelling made this PSA in 2016? Yeah, they made a PSA about a bunch of fairy tale creatures making a rhyme for baby CPR, and it's pretty enjoyable. RSA. RSA is an Irish company that makes PSAs about the dangers of driving, if it's drink driving, speeding, or anything else. The company's made some disturbing PSAs, but to be completely honest, their PSAs aren't memorable at all in my opinion. I'm not saying they're bad at all, but it's just nothing to say about them. Creeping. This is a PSA from South Australia that was released sometime in the 2000s from the company Mac of South Australia. The PSA follows a few different scenarios where people are going too fast and can't slow down in time, so they cause accidents. It starts with a car hitting two people crossing the road, and then the PSA flashes different videos of accidents caused by the same thing. The PSA ends with a shot of someone driving as cuts and bruises fade onto their face and then fade off of his face. Then fade off of his face, and then the text "Stop Creeping" comes up on screen. Is there anybody out there? Another Samaritan's PSA, but this PSA came out in the year 1986, which obviously released in the UK, and it features the Pink Floyd song "Is There Anybody Out There" from their album The Wall. As the song's playing, we see a grey wall and then a person trying to get through the walls. We see their hands and head pushing up against the wall. We see that the man's struggling to get through the walls. He ends up screaming because he can't get through. The person ends up slowly giving up after frantically trying to get through, and when the person pulls away, the text says yes. The Samaritans comes up, responding to the question if anybody is there to help. Neighbours. Neighbours is a PSA from the company Family Violence Prevention Fund that was released sometime in the 90s. PSA follows a couple in bed as we hear the couple arguing in an apartment above them. We hear that the woman in the apartment above is being abused, and as the couple are in bed, they don't do anything and they just try to go to sleep. After this happens, text fades in saying it is your business. Mirror. A Swedish PSA from the company Anorexia Bulimic Conduct, released in 2007, shows a young woman looking at herself in a mirror as she seems to be unsatisfied with how she looks. We can tell she doesn't like her body. She keeps grabbing parts of her body and thinking that she's overweight and not healthy. This is until the camera pans out to slowly show that the girl in the PSA is actually anorexic and sees herself in a different way to how she actually looks. Text fades in saying help people with eating disorders. SWR. A company from Germany that actually stands for Südwest Rundfunk, I probably fucking butchered that, is a broadcasting station that broadcasts radio and TV stations. They were founded in 1998, but from 1999 onwards, they started making PSAs for their radio and TV stations. Their most well-known PSAs are Day Trip, Amok, and Nightmare. Day Trip is by far their most well-known PSA, and I've talked about this one a lot, where a father and son walk around a city and see disturbing things. The things they see is such as a man being hit by a car, a fist fight, and a woman possibly being raped. But PSAs like Amok are just really offensive, making the Columbine school shooting that happened in 1999 into a video game to say video games called school shootings. I really wouldn't be surprised if this company just made these ridiculously over-the-top PSAs just to get attention. SWR hasn't made any good PSAs in my eyes, and the PSAs they've made either seem to not deliver their messages across well, or just don't understand what they're talking about. Photograph. This is a Scottish PSA from the company Scotland Against Drugs that was released in 1996, showing a teenager in a photograph slowly deteriorating over time. The first thing that happens is some spots appear on his face as well as teeth rotting to make him look worse. The picture then changes to the video of the teen looking more stressed before it changes back to an image of the teen. More video shows up of the team stressing out, nearly having an anxiety attack, until the photo changes of the team being deformed with a bit of Photoshop's liquify tool. The photo then slowly fades to black. I find it hard to understand why people find this PSA to be really scary. It's a cool concept and all to really show the transformation of how drugs can really ruin someone's appearance, but this PSA doesn't do it that well. Faroe Islands. Faroe Islands is a British PSA from the Whale and Dolphin Conservation, which was released in 1989 and has Anthony Hopkins narrating the PSA. This PSA is an animated short that uses paintings for its animation, and it's quite unique because of that. The narrator tells the story of the Faroe Islands, where people from far and wide come to the islands to kill and cut up whales for them all to eat. When the people in the story kill all the whales and feed them to the crowd, the rest of the whales are left on the beach to rot. The PSA ends with the company's logo. Speed of fire. A New Zealand PSA from the year 2002 tries to tell people to stay safe around fire. The PSA mainly shows the viewer that the spread of fire is extremely unpredictable. This PSA has two different versions, one where it's the full PSA start to finish, and then there's another where it's cut up throughout 3 minutes with different ads in between different segments of the PSA. Such a brilliant idea for a PSA that plays out like a ticking time bomb, because at the end of the PSA the whole fire is in a blaze where we see the New Zealand Fire Service logo. Hand. This is a 1998 PSA released from the UK company Fireworks Safety, and as the company's name says, they make PSAs to warn people against the dangers of fireworks. The PSA has someone light a firework whilst holding it in their hand, as we hear people in the background counting from 10 to 0. At number 4, the firework blows up in his hand, and we see the end result where the hand is missing 2 fingers, and the text blast off comes up. Finally, at the end of the PSA, the text throwing fireworks, it's not worth the risk comes up. No Brainer. No Brainer is another PSA from New Zealand that released in 2003 from the company Karen Z. It follows a man at a nightclub going to walk into the bathroom. He goes into one of the stalls and locks the door, as we see the man pull the top of his head back to reveal his brain, as he grabs a bit of his brain to line up like it's cocaine on the toilet seat lid. The man cuts it up and then snorts his brain up. After he does that, we see that his pupils get bigger as the text fades in saying every day more and more people line themselves up to destroy themselves. Very subtle, telling people that drugs like cocaine destroy your brain. I see what you did there. NIFRS. This is an Irish company that stands for the Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue Service, and they made PSAs around the mid-2000s trying to tell people to be safe around fire and not to leave things unattended. There are 2 PSAs from this company I could find. One has a man leave a pot on, and the other has a fire brigade in a burnt house as they find out that their kid died in a house fire because the family didn't have a plan to escape. GLC. So the GLC is known as the Greater London Council, and this council sometimes partnered up with organisations like CRY to create PSAs. In one of their PSAs called Risks, an old couple's gone to bed as they leave their chimney fire lit. A narrator starts talking and tells the viewer not to leave fires lit, and when the old couple leave, the fire spreads until eventually the whole house is on fire and we see it from the outside of the house. Another PSA from the company is the PSA called Shut It Out. In this PSA, we follow a young girl as she's walking to a room. The girl gets to the room, and as she's shutting the door, a narrator comes in to say each night you go to bed, close the door as it should hold back any fire. When the girl shuts the door, the tank shoots out a blast of fire at the door and continues to shoot at the door to emphasize that shutting your door will give you time to escape a house fire. DTR. A company from the UK that made PSAs in 1999 follows a few different perspectives in a car crash. They released 4 PSAs all in the same year, in which 3 of them focus around the person that caused the car crash, and another PSA called Mike and Joy, which focuses on a victim's parents. All the PSAs are quite the same, where the PSA asks people a question. In the 3 PSAs about people that actually caused the accidents, the question is what is it like to kill someone, and for the Mike and Joy PSA, the question is what is it like to lose someone. All of the PSAs are absolutely fantastic, and I think the Mike and Molly PSA is the most effective as you get to hear the parents talk about how horrible it is to deal with a daughter that passed away. All of these PSAs end with the text, please don't drink and drive, as all of these accidents were caused by someone drinking and driving. Monolith/Iceberg. Both of these PSAs from 1987 and 1986 both came out from the National Health for the UK, and they also both talk about how dangerous AIDS is. In Monolith, we see some natural disasters and then a man carving something as a narrator talks about how dangerous AIDS is and how you can get the disease. It ends with a carving showing that it's AIDS, and the narrator tells the viewer that they should read the pamphlet and not die of ignorance. In the Iceberg PSA, it has a camera pan around the tip of the iceberg as the text shows up saying how AIDS can be spread, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. After that, the camera goes underneath the water to see AIDS engraven into the iceberg, and it ends the same way as the Monolith PSA. Eyes. This is a UK PSA from the company Safety on the Move, released in 1992, and it follows a woman lying down the road as we stare into her eyes. Throughout the PSA, we hear people trying to resuscitate her, and we see her pupils grow and then shrink to size to show that she's passed away. We hear the person that's caused the accident say I didn't mean it, after being told that there's still no response, and after that the text drinking and driving wrecks lives comes up. This PSA is a part of that campaign, which actually has quite a few PSAs made for it, such as the Dave one, which I've mentioned a lot. Scream. Scream is a British PSA from the Samaritans that released in 1989, and it's my personal favourite Samaritans PSA. It follows a woman in a light blue room as she's trying to talk to the camera, but all that's coming out is distorted guitar sounds. This keeps going on until she starts to get upset and starts to break down as she's trying to talk, but she can't. She ends up breaking down when the text Samaritans Understand fades in, and more lighthearted music fades in when the text does. WorkSafe Victoria. An Aussie company based in Victoria that was made for the safety of workers in any work environment. The company's most well-known PSAs, released around the late 2000s and early 2010s, was PSAs like Beth, Bakery, and Kitchen. WorkSafe Victoria still makes PSAs to this day, and even their most recent PSA came out last year, and it's all about workers getting harassed and abused in their workplace.
As someone that lives in Victoria, these PSAs are really well known. A lot of people still remember them today. Also, I could go up to pretty much anyone in the state of Victoria and talk about these PSAs, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I remember seeing that when I was younger. Oh yeah, I remember that on Channel 10 at like 12 PM on a Saturday.
Queensland Transport. This company is an Australian company quite like TAC, which I'll mention later, but in Queensland instead of Victoria. Queensland Transport started making PSAs in the late 90s, and all throughout the 2000s, with their most popular PSA definitely being Pram. All of Queensland Transport's PSAs are quite the same, and most of them are about speeding and the terrible things that can happen if you're speeding and not driving responsibly.
The company doesn't actually have that many PSAs, but they're mainly remembered for the Pram one.
Drinking and driving wrecks lives. A series of PSAs that all tie into this campaign, which is drinking and driving wrecks lives. This series of PSAs were mostly released around the 90s, and all the PSAs show the different ways on how drinking and driving can ruin lives from yours to others around you. The most well-known PSA in the campaign by far is Dave, which I've talked about 1,000 times now. TAC. TAC, or the Transport Accident Commission, is an Aussie company based in Victoria that tries to prevent car accidents from happening. TAC are known for their PSAs covering many different topics about driving, such as drink driving, driving on drugs, and speeding, to name a few. They've had some great PSAs throughout the years, such as curtain airbags, what happens when you wipe 5 off, and if you drive on drugs you're out of your mind, to name a few. I have said in the past that the company was falling off with their quality of PSAs, but this year when they released 2 new PSAs, such as the one that's on the screen, they've actually increased in quality and starting to get a lot better again.
Also, I love it that this company has a film competition every year where they give people the opportunity to script a public service announcement for them to make the next year.
I'll quickly touch on these PSAs, as 2 of the bad PSAs I mentioned are from this competition, but there are some great ones, such as Yes Mum from 2012,
which, if I was to be honest, it's one of the best PSAs of all time.
and ZTA. This company is quite the same as TAC, but for New Zealand instead. The New Zealand Transport Agency released PSAs throughout the 90s and 2000s, mostly highlighting drunk driving and speeding. The main PSAs from this company are Murderer, Consequences, and Split.
There are some good PSAs they've made, but there's not much to say here, really.
Natural Born Smoker and Baby. Both Natural Born Smoker and Baby are PSAs released in 1985 from the UK. They both follow this weird looking natural born smoker as the narrator talks about the person, or in the case of the Baby PSA, the baby itself. In Natural Born Smoker, the PSA highlights how the person is a natural born smoker and it's not a real thing. And in the Baby PSA, they show how a natural born smoker would raise a baby to be a natural born smoker. Padlock. A 2006 PSA from Quebec, released by the company CSST, shows a man doing his job and having to pull a lever. The man comes back to activate the machine, and when he does, he flattens someone's head. The PSA ends with the text Padlock. Car Park. Car Park is a British PSA from the company Calm, released in 2006. The PSA follows a man parking in a car park as he seems to be going to work. We then see another man seemingly walk up to him. The man that's going out of the car thinks the other guy's going to hurt him, and as the PSA cuts to black, text comes up saying 3 men are killed in Britain every day. It cuts back to the man as we see that the man that was scared is actually unharmed by the other person because they just walked past him. But after that, we see the hooded man standing on the edge of the car park as he falls off the edge. Text fades in saying he can help stop suicide. Devil. This is a PSA released in 1999 from the company Smokeline in Norway, and the PSA follows a man that's meant to be the devil talking to the camera. The devil asks if there are any smokers out there as he lists a few facts about smoking, like how 50% of smokers will die from smoking. He then decides to flip a coin to decide which 50% of people die, and as he flips the coin, he looks at the coin and then just laughs.
Obviously, the PSA is trying to say that there's always a chance that you'll die from smoking, so it's better off not to do it at all. By the way, I really like the performance this guy's giving in this PSA. It's pretty solid. Dirt Racer. A PSA released in the year 2000 from the Aussie company Market Force follows kids playing with their tricycles called dirt races.
The PSA plays out like an ad for the product, where the kids are enjoying riding on tricycles, until one of the kids accidentally ends up riding on the road and getting hit by a car. We see a broken tricycle in front of the car, and then the camera pans to the driver, upset, as the narrator says you can't always see what's coming. 10 kilometers an hour makes a big difference. Have a break. This 2011 PSA from Greenpeace in the UK follows an officer worker needing a break. The PSA imitates a Kit Kat commercial where their slogan is "Have a break, have a Kit Kat." But the man goes to pull out his Kit Kat, and as he opens it, we see an orangutan finger. Everyone else seems to see it except for him, as his co-worker is in shock as he takes a bite at the finger. Text then comes in to say give the orangutan a break, as their rainforests are being cut down by companies that Nestle partners it with to get their palm oil for their chocolate. High Rise. High Rise is a New Zealand PSA from 2006 from LTNZ. The PSA follows a family in the car as the narrator talks about when people drive fast they don't realise the danger they're in. We then see that a car is a floor off the road, and the narrator tells us that this is what a 90km/h car crash feels like in a car. We then see another car up 5 floors, and the narrator tells us that's how it feels at 110km/h. And finally, we can see a car 9 floors off the ground. The narrator says this is a 125km/h crash. The PSA ends at the top car falling as it cuts black. Text comes in then saying, the faster you go, the bigger the mess. Inside Out. This is a 2003 PSA from South Africa made by the company National Council Against Smoking. The PSA follows a woman in a forest all alone. As she moves her head to face the camera, she pulls out a cigarette and starts to smoke it. When she's doing this, the camera is panning around her until a tree wipes across, and then we see her skin looking completely burnt as she's still smoking a cigarette. Smoke then covers the screen and text fades in saying, would you still be smoking if it did to your outside what it does to your inside? Made in Taiwan. A PSA from the UK made by the company EIA that released in 1995 shows a group of rhinos on a TV. A narrator comes in to talk about the species of animals and that they are almost the last of their species. After that, blood starts shooting out the side of the TV, and the narrator talks about how rhinos are being hunted and exploited only in Taiwan because it's the only country that hasn't made hunting rhinos illegal. Playhouse. Playhouse is a New Zealand PSA released in 2005 from the company Women's Refuge. The PSA acts like a typical kids show where a woman's making a cake in a playhouse as the father gets home from work. Everything seems normal and happy, like a kids show, until a woman accidentally knocks over a cup. The music then cuts out when the cup falls over, and the man seems to get annoyed, and after that, the father pushes the woman against the oven. It cuts the text saying that last year we helped over 10,000 children.
I actually really like the approach of this PSA. I thought it was a bit ridiculous at first, but when you really think about it as an interpretation of how a child sees this situation, it's pretty well done.
Red Banana. A 2004 PSA from Italy depicts a child being tested on with a bunch of toys as the child goes around playing with different toys until it comes across a red banana. When the child plays with the red banana, we see a general of an army as well as a few scientists are watching this unfold. As we see the people watching the little girl in this scenario, we hear the banana explode. The last thing we see in this PSA is a toy train driving past the girl's blown off foot. SAAQ. So SAAQ is a company from Quebec, and they usually make PSAs about car accidents and trying to prevent them from happening. I've talked about the PSA to Hero Zero in the past, which shows real footage of a man speeding and flipping his car over when he was at 200km/h, and unfortunately he died from the crash. The company started making PSAs in the 90s and still make PSAs to this day, and their most recent one I've seen is from about 2020 and it's about marijuana use whilst driving. It's a strange PSA where a weed plant takes the wheel and makes people in the car crash head on with a car passing by. Accident. An Aussie PSA made in the 90s from the company Transport Safety follows two different scenarios in a split screen style. One scenario where a woman gets hit by a car, and the other scenario is where a woman's walking along and she avoids a car crash. At the end of the PSA, speeds are revealed on each side of the split screen, showing that in the situation on the right, he was 17 kilometers over the speed limit. Homefront. Homefront's a Canadian company that released two domestic PSAs in the year 2003. Their most well-known PSA is the coffee PSA, so we'll talk about that one first. We start with a family eating lunch at some restaurant as a worker comes to ask the man if he wants coffee. The man says yes please, and the worker pours the coffee and accidentally spills a little bit of it. The man laughs it off at first saying that she spilled the coffee, but he then gets angry and calls her a fucking bitch, and then grabs her and pours coffee all over her and then smacks her. After that, a narrator comes in to say you wouldn't get away with it here, so you won't get away with it at home. The other PSA is called Office that has the same premise, but instead of a restaurant, it's an office, and the man abused the co-worker after they stated their opinion on a topic.
I remember these PSAs blow up at one point because you really don't expect how the PSA will land.
Corpse. This is an Aussie PSA released in 2000 from the company ORS. We follow a few people speeding in a red muscle car swerving in and out of lanes as rock music plays. Then we see the people in the car enjoying themselves and talking about a party, until we see that the people in the car look like corpses with widened out eyes and cuts all over their bodies. All the people that are in the car are trying to encourage the driver to drive faster and faster, and then the text comes up saying, "Speed and you're as good as dead. Don't let ice destroy you." Another Aussie PSA released in the 2000s, but this PSA is from the Australian government. This PSA follows one doctor as she narrates the PSA and talks about the effects of ice, whilst we see visual representations of this and what drugs can do to people. The PSA follows one doctor as she talks about the effects of ice, whilst we see visual representations of what the drug can do to people. Things we see are people dig into their own skin and even someone going nuts in a police station. The PSA ends with the line, "Don't let ice destroy you." Double accident. A French PSA from 2006 made by DSCR depicts the result of a car crash, which is a car flipped over in the middle of the road, as two people in the car are talking to each other. Text comes up, which is actually in French, and it translates to that day he was driving too fast. This is until all of a sudden, as the man's trying to get out of the car, another car comes in head on with theirs. More text comes up saying, "and he was driving a little too fast." The PSA ends with a text that says, "Always obey speed limits." Impacts. This is a PSA from the Denmark company Danish Road Safety Council, released in 1999. We follow a doctor as he's talking in Danish to the viewer about how the human body isn't made to withstand a car crash, and that injuries similar to sports injuries can even occur at 30 kilometers an hour. In the PSA, we see visual representations of everything the doctor's talking about, but the doctor continues to say that a small speed increase may cause serious implications. The example that the doctor gives is being hit at 40 kilometers an hour would feel like a 6-meter fall. The PSA ends with the doctor saying that 50 kilometers an hour, there isn't much he can do, and it's a job for his colleagues in the basement. It rarely stops. An American PSA that's released in 2010 from the National Domestic Violence Hotline depicts a woman staring at the camera with bruised eyes and tears down her face. The woman's trying to cover up her abuse until more cuts and bruises show up on her face after covering up the first set of bruises on her face. PSA ends with her frantically looking to her right as the text "It rarely stops" fades in. Lend a hand. Lend a Hand is a 2000s PSA made by Unifem in America, and it shows a couple eating dinner whilst we can hear another couple arguing. This is until we can hear the man hit his partner, and we even see a painting move on the wall because he threw her against the wall. The man at the dinner table ends up getting up to deal with the situation by grabbing a bat and going to the door. He knocks at their door and the man answers. The man with the bat then gives the other man the bat and says, "Thought you could use this." Text fades in saying, "Do nothing, you may as well lend a hand." Vivisected. A PSA from 1990 from the company Thames Television in the UK shows a rat being vivisected. But a narrator comes in to ask what a rat eats. Then we see what a rat eats with some text such as like chip packets, sweet wrappers, and fast food containers. The narrator then says that rats spread disease, and the more litter we have, the more rats will come, as we see the rat cut open. Text fades in saying, "More litter isn't a disgrace, it's a danger." Dave. Dave's a 2005 PSA from the Road Safety Council in Australia showing how bad car crashes can injure people. The PSA shows a car crash of a poor old AU Falcon. The narrator tells us that in a car crash, how hard you hit something is determined by how fast you're going. But the PSA gets rid of the car and just shows Dave floating in the air as like he's driving the car, showing the injuries he would receive from a car crash like this. It shows everything that would happen to his body, and at the end of the PSA, his body falls to the ground as text comes in saying "Drop 5 saves lives" shows up. The Exploding Tiger Trick. This PSA was released in 1996 from the company EIA in the UK. In this PSA, we see some kind of magic trick where a magician pulls a tiger into a box. The narrator talks about how India made a reserve to protect the remaining tigers, the national symbol of their country. The magician puts the tiger into the box, and then he stabs swords into the box as the tiger is screaming. We see blood coming out of the box, and the narrator comes back to say that one tiger is killed every day, and if this continues, there will be none left. When the narrator finishes, the magician opens the box to only see blood all over the box but no tiger. Text comes in saying, "Tell the Indian government you don't want the tiger to disappear." Smile. A PSA from the company Boave, released in the year 1989 from the UK. This PSA follows a woman staring at the camera as a cover of the song Smile is playing in the background. We see the girl getting makeup on, but as she does this, we see the marks of a go up on her face, such as scars on the cheek and cuts on her lips. The PSA ends when we get to see all of the marks all over her face as she's looking to the camera. A narrator comes in to say, "Every year thousands of animals suffer this pain in the name of beauty." After that, the woman in the PSA screams as it fades to black. The Family. The family is a 2002 PSA from DSR in France, and it follows a family as they're eating breakfast and getting ready to leave the house. We see the daughter and son waiting to leave as the father's getting his keys to take them out, probably to school. They all leave, but then all three of them are just sitting on a balcony that's meant to imitate a car drive, as we hear the car engine and we see them just sitting on the balcony. It's until we hear car brakes that all three of them get thrown off the balcony to their death. French narration comes in as the PSA fades black, and it shows some text that roughly translates to at the front as at the back. The place of the dead is that without a seatbelt. Summer holiday. An Aussie PSA released in the year 2000 from the company RTA follows a family about to go on a summer holiday. But we see the family packing up the car to get ready to go on their holiday as their older son documents the events with his camera. The family finally gets on the road as the boy is just recording random things such as a man on a boat and his younger brother. This is until when he's eating a lolly, the family gets into a car crash and the boy's face ends up in front of the camera as text fades in saying 2 people die every day of the holidays. Scarhead. This is yet another Aussie PSA and it's from the Pedestrian Council of Australia as it was released in 2005. All we see in this PSA is a man's forehead as he starts going faster and faster when riding his motorbike, the bigger the scar gets on his head. The scar eventually goes all the way across his forehead and when it does, the text "Speed kills, slow down" shows up. The Mistake. The Mistake is a French PSA from the company DSR yet again, but released in 2005. The PSA follows a family driving a car. A narrator as well as text comes in to say something is missing from his car, but everything goes along normally as the family's driving along and the narrator comes in to say any clue. After that, the father slams on the brakes as one of the passengers in the back goes flying through the windscreen. Text comes in to say the rear passenger's seatbelt as everyone else in the car is panicking about what they have just seen. The narrator then says to always buckle up in the back. The Silent Killer. An Aussie PSA that released in 2012 from the company Stroke Foundation is all about educating people about strokes. In this PSA, we follow a man talking to the viewer with 4 covered dishes and a table in front of him. The man talks about how 1 in every 6 Australians has the markings of a bloodthirsty killer inside of them. He goes on to say that the doctors call it a stroke. As he shows that one of the dishes is a brain, he also says that a stroke is the second biggest cause of deaths in Australia. The man mentions that some of you might be lucky to survive, but then he starts cutting into a brain showing that you could lose the ability to talk, to comprehend, or even control your bladder. The PSA ends with the man smashing a brain with a hammer, and then the PSA ends with the man saying, "So ends the lesson and your life." Toy Gun. Toy Gun's a PSA from Scotland in 2009, made by the company Safer Scotland. It starts with a doll with the text saying "toy doll" and then a gun showing up with more text saying "toy gun" with a question mark at the end. It then goes back to the toy doll as the gun shoots off half the doll's face with blood gushing out of the doll's face. It ends with the text "an air gun is not a toy." Uncle Mark. This is a 2000s PSA from the New Zealand company Had Enough, and it plays out the events of a family barbecue. Uncle Mark is swinging a kid around and doing other things with the family having some fun. We then see him drink and slowly get more and more drunk as the night goes on until he's really drunk at the end, like late at night. He decides to swing a child around that wants to be swung around, even though he's really drunk, and when he does this, he accidentally hits the child's head against the cupboard. Everyone freaks out as he's told to get out. Mark then leaves and starts crying up against the fence as text fades in saying, "It's not the drinking, it's how we're drinking." What If It Was You? What If It Was You is a 2014 PSA from the company League Against Cruel Sports in the UK. We follow a mother with their baby as they see something outside. They go outside to see something disturbing. The mother puts the baby back in the cradle as the mother runs away stealing from something or someone. But the mother keeps on running for a while until they seem to get stopped by some dogs as we hear barking when she falls over. We cut back to the baby as the text "What If It Was You" fades in. Join us now to stop illegal fox hunting. Tier 4. Very scary. Excuses. This is a PSA from the company NSPCC that released in 1991. In the PSA, we see photos of different children as the song "Tell Me There's a Heaven" from Chris Rea plays in the background. With each photo, text comes up talking about the excuses parents give for their injuries that their child had received because of the parents abusing their child. After each excuse, the PSA has more text countering the parents' excuses, pointing out the other injuries that the child has. The PSA last parent's excuse is that they had their turn back for a minute, and the text after that says that the report showed multiple bruises, internal bleeding, fractured ribs, malnutrition, and dehydration, consistent only with long-term abuse. The PSA ends with the text, "There's never an excuse for children, there's no excuse for ignoring it." Maynika. A PSA released in 1997 from the company National Children's Month in the Philippines starts off with someone holding a toy doll as the narrator is talking to the viewer in Filipino.
They're saying listen to those children crying at the cruelty as we see the person squeeze the doll as we hear the children crying in the background. The narrator continues by saying hurt, exploited, asking for help as we keep seeing more of what we've seen before until a title card comes up saying stop child comes up. The narrator then comes back to say their salvation is in your hands, and then more text comes up saying children have rights, people have duties. Partnership for a Drug-Free Singapore. Partnership for a Drug-Free Singapore is a well-known company for making anti-drug PSAs throughout the late 90s. The most well-known PSAs are Rats, Blender, and by far the most popular Partnership for a Drug-Free Singapore PSA, You're the Guinea Pig. In the Rats PSA, we see a man in chains as the narrator talks about how people used to be tortured by getting eaten alive by rats. We see the rats bite into the man as it's used as a metaphor for what heroin does to your body. Rats ends with the text 4 out of 5 people who try heroin never escape. Heroin is a living hell. In Blender, the PSA shows a brain in a blender and then a man puts ecstasy in the blender with the brain. The narrator asks, ever wonder what ecstasy does to your brain? And as he asks that, he turns the blender on. Now let's talk about one of my most favourite PSAs of all time, You're the Guinea Pig. It shows a man strapped down in a chair being tested on by a group of scientists. These scientists are testing the effects of ecstasy on a man whilst the narrator says no one knows how much brain damage ecstasy causes and that it's still being tested. You're the Guinea Pig ends with the line to take ecstasy and you're the guinea pig, as we see the man in the chair struggling to get out and the PSA fades to black. Searching. A fire prevention PSA from 1974 in the UK shows someone walking around a burnt down house as we hear radio of people yelling out to each other echoing. The man keeps walking around the house, as well as seeing how badly the house is burnt down. The PSA ends with one of the bedrooms as the video burns the text saying keep matches away from children. Seer. Seer is a company from the Netherlands that released quite a few fireworks PSAs around the 90s and 2000s. Their most well-known PSAs are definitely Countdown, Shadow Puppets, and Sign Language. Countdown's a 1996 PSA that tells people not to mess with fireworks by counting down from 10. When the PSA is counting down, you can see hands slowly lose fingers as the numbers go down until there are eventually no fingers left at the end of the PSA. Text fades in with the campaign slogan, Jerks only mess with fireworks, which was actually their campaign that they're running all throughout the 90s. Shadow Puppets shows two hands creating shadow puppets of animals such as a dove, a swan, and a rabbit, as well as a few different other animals. This keeps going on until at the end of the PSA the music slows down as we see a person with a missing hand. When the missing hand comes up, the PSA says run, which roughly translates to idiot in English. The PSA ends with the same campaign's text. In sign language, it has the same background as the Countdown PSA with a full red, but this time the PSA is talking to us in sign language. The PSA is telling us about firework victims and how they lose their hearing or they receive serious injuries. As this is happening, the hands slowly lose fingers and the sign language gets harder and harder to understand because the fingers are going away. Hansel and Gretel Foundation PSA. In this PSA by the company Hansel and Gretel Against Child, released in the 2000s from Denmark, we hear a girl laughing as we see a page in a fairy tale book of an old man and what's meant to be Gretel. As we hear the girls laugh, we hear a woman say, "What do you hear? Do you hear a little girl having an If so, we'll do everything we can to put you in jail." The laughing stops and the woman says, "If not, please donate." Nightmare. This is a Scottish PSA from the Scottish Office Fire Safety from 1995, shows the events of a man's nightmare where a house fire is occurring as we see a photo of the man's family burning. We hear the kids screaming throughout the PSA, which switches from being a normal photo to a video of the family begging for help as the man's trying to reach out to them. We see them disappear one by one until the man wakes up alone in his bed full of sweat. His alarm's beeping and that's what woke him up, so he turns it off and grabs the photo of his family on the bedside table. The man looks at the photo and holds it up against himself as the narrator tells the viewer to always check their smoke alarm and to plan your escape or you might live to regret it. This one honestly just hits in the feels, like damn, it hits hard at the end. Disasters. Disasters is a PSA that was released in 1991 from the UK company Disaster Action, and it follows a person with a flashlight as they look around an area with dead bodies wrapped in newspapers. We hear a narrator say vague things like King's Cross and Piper Alpha as we see more dead bodies until the narrator says hundreds of victims and thousands of lives ruined. The narrator keeps going on saying it's time to put lives before profits, time to tighten the laws, and to put safety first before the next disaster. I don't know if this PSA is referring to some kind of event or if it's just saying its message in general, but I do feel like it's trying to say something about a certain event that happened around the time in the UK. Night vision. This is a PSA from Fire Kills in 2004, follows a few different scenarios where people on a house fire don't know what to do and end up being stuck in their house. They also tell you to make sure you have your exits clear in case of a house fire. The PSA ends with the text, "Make your plan." It's quite an effective and disturbing PSA, and also straightforward, so there's not really much to say about this one.
Stairs. Stairs is a PSA from the company Family Prevention Fund, which is a company I mentioned earlier in this video, and this PSA released sometime in the 1990s. The PSA follows a kid sitting on top of the stairs as they're listening to their parents argue. We then hear that the father starts with their mother because the father didn't get any pizza. In this PSA, when they see the kids' faces watching in shock at the whole situation. PSA ends with the text, "Children have to sit by and watch. What's your excuse?" Boiled bear, anyone? A British PSA from the company Task Force, released in 1996, and all we see is text on the screen for a recipe on how to boil a bear. As the text is coming up, we can hear the audio of a bear being boiled alive as people are trying to cook the bear to eat. The narrator comes in at the end of the PSA to say bears are considered a gourmet food in the Far East, despite the fact that the species is endangered and close to extinction. Chase. This 1998 PSA from the UK, made by IFAW, follows the perspective of a fox walking around the wild. This happens for a while, walking across roads and through different forests until a dog eventually finds the fox and drags it out of a hole. After that, we see photos of foxes because of fox hunting, and then text fades in to say, "For pity's sake, ban fox hunting now." Which, from what I know, apparently this is still an issue in the UK, which is actually just depressing. Dangerous machine. A PSA from Quebec made by the company CSST in 2006. It follows a man working in a factory in front of some machinery. The man slides down a piece of metal, and when he does that, his long sleeve shirt gets stuck into the machine. The man tries calling out for help, but no one comes to help as he gets closer and closer to being crushed. His hand eventually starts to get crushed, and this man's struggling to get out as the PSA fades to black and text comes up saying, "Seen enough? Us too. Machines cause 35 accidents a day." Game. Game is a PSA from the League Against Cruel Sports in the UK, released in 1989. The PSA follows a man as he's getting on a horse to go fox hunting. He's ready, and then he starts to enjoy being on the horse a little too much. It's a bit strange. Text about fox hunting keeps coming up as the man slowly gets more and more gross as he's trying to hunt the foxes. This keeps on going until we see that he's rocking the horse, and he passes out on the horse, and then more text comes up saying, "How do you get your kicks?" Gas chamber. Gas chamber is a Japanese PSA from the company Alive, released in 2004, and it follows a point of view where we see how some animals are being gassed to death. We can hear a dog crying in one of those chambers as text comes up saying 450,000 dogs and cats are disposed of yearly in gas chambers. We then see another shot where they're putting a dog in one of these chambers, and then text comes up saying, "Please don't throw away your pets." This one's honestly kind of hard to watch. It's just upsetting hearing the animals, how they're crying out for help. Monsters. A 2012 PSA from the company Fragile Childhood in Finland tackles how children see parents when intoxicated. The PSA follows a few different scenarios where children are with their parents and the children see them as something else, and always something disturbing. We see children see their parents as a giant ugly rabbit, a grim reaper, a zombie, and a clown, to name a few. The PSA ends with one kid seeing their father as a robber, and as they're putting the seatbelt on them, text comes in saying, "How do our children see us when we've been drinking?" A lot of people really overhype how scary this PSA is, and honestly, in my opinion, it is disturbing, don't get me wrong. But people act like it's the scariest of all time. Nah, you gotta watch more PSAs. Kitchen Mother. This is a Japanese PSA released in 1982 from the Japanese government public relations. We follow a mother passed out on a table as their child's crying next to them. The narrator comes in to say that recently stimulant drugs are destroying housewives, young people, and salaried workers. The PSA then shows the mother using a needle to inject themselves with some drugs as they fade out the shot. We only see the child crying as the narrator says, however, not only will it destroy yourself, your family will also be destroyed. Text then fades in saying, "Let's expel stimulant drugs from everyone." Milk. Milk is a 2003 PSA from the Taiwan company Child Protection Hotline. This PSA has a child singing a song until we see a trail of blood on the floor. The camera follows the blood until we see more and more dripping on the floor. The camera pans up to where the blood's dripping from and we see a milk carton in which the blood changes from milk on the table. Text comes up saying, "She, Shen Shao, 3 years old. Cause of brain damage, hemorrhage." Spilled milk comes up. PSA then cuts to black where more text comes in saying, "In Taiwan, there are children violently every day." Distress call. This is a PSA released in the year 2002 for the American company Haven, and it follows a real call to the authorities, where we hear what it seems to be a young girl begging for help as we see images of what the situation must have been like. The authorities ask if the perpetrator has a gun or a knife, where the girl says yes, and the young girl screams for their mum as she is being and we see text pop up saying, "Every day, 7 women are killed." Narrator comes in to say, if you or someone you know is a victim of domestic or to call haven. Stop. A PSA from the company Transport Safety in Australia, released in 1997. The PSA follows a family in their cars. Two young girls are singing "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," and we see that the father's going above the speed limit. We then see that someone stopped right after a turn, which is a really shitty thing to do. Like, if you're pulling over, why would you stop right after a turn? That's going to cause an accident. So the driver has to go into the other lane to overtake the car that stopped. The narrator comes in to say if the driver had kept this car to 100 k's, he would have stopped here. And the narrator then talks about each family member as we see them and the injuries or death that could have been avoided if Jim's dad wasn't speeding. After that, the narrator says it's too late for that now, and the car continues to go again as the family spin out and crash into a wooden pole. The last thing we see is the aftermath, where the mother's dead in the car and one of the daughters is crying. The hostage. The most disturbing PSA from the company in France Epotage, released in 2006. The PSA follows a family of 3 eating at a dinner table until the mother slaps her son in the face and the father grabs the son by the ear. The father pulls him by the ear into the room and starts whipping him with his belt until it fades the text. The text says this is a dramatization. In reality, the victim is 6 years old. I'm gonna be honest here, that one just hits hard. Tier 5. Hard to watch. Can't look. Another PSA from NSPCC that was released in 1999 follows a few different scenarios of children being. It starts with the baby being yelled at by their mother as the baby won't stop crying. The next scenario is with the child's father telling them to come sit in the bed with them, obviously insinuating something terrible. Father yelling at their son or daughter, a kid at home alone wanting their mum to come home, and the PSA ends with the man saying not a word to anyone as the Spice Girls have their eyes covered with their hands. It ends with the narrator saying we can't bear to look either, and that cruelty to children can be stopped. Baby monitor. This is a South African PSA released in 2003 from the company Women Against Child, and it shows a mother listening to a baby monitor where a partner is saying their child. The mother starts to cry as she hears this happening. As that's happening, a narrator comes in to say if you don't stop him from her, who will? Tentacle. Tentacle's a German PSA released in 2008 by the company Dunkelziffer. The PSA tackles long-term effects of child by using a tentacle as a metaphor for the events the main character remembers. We follow a young girl with a tentacle staying with her as she grows up. The girl keeps getting older and older and the tentacle stays with her until she is an old woman and eventually passes away. The tentacle then finally leaves when she passes away as text fades in saying if children never get help, they never outgrow their trauma. Hey, it's another one I find really hard to watch. I feel like it's just ones that cover this subject matter just really disturbs me. Torture by another name. A 2007 PSA released by the Helen Barmer Foundation in the UK depicts a woman in bed talking to the viewer about 2 different people, presumably her before and her now, whilst getting The 2 perspectives keep switching back and forth, showing how bad of a situation she is in now being trafficked for The PSA ends with her turning on her back, and the text women enslaved by trafficking lose more than just their names. Trapped. This is an Aussie PSA released in 2014 from the company MSWA, and it follows a person being trapped in a small enclosed area. We see them slipping as they're trying to get out and even panicking. They start to scream out for help as they're banging against one of the walls of the enclosed space. We then cut to someone looking at a photo as the person stuck in the small space is looking out at them. But it's finally revealed to us that the person stuck in the enclosed space is actually a person with multiple sclerosis, and that what we saw was a metaphor for what it feels like to have the condition. Text fades up saying multiple sclerosis can trap you within your own body. Help us find a cure. Wedding. Wedding is yet another Aussie PSA, but this one's from the 2000s and made by adult surviving child. The PSA plays out the events of a father giving a speech at his daughter's wedding. Everything seems to be quite normal until he starts making jokes about the terrible things he has done to his daughter and everyone laughs at what he's saying. He keeps on going on about similar things throughout the PSA until text fades in saying, if only it was this easy to get over child. For more than 1 million Australians, it isn't. That was the Mega PSA Iceberg. So as I said at the start of the video, this is basically an extension of the Ultimate PSA Iceberg, and basically what I did is I added at least another 70 entries to this iceberg to really flesh it out more, because as I said in the Ultimate PSA Iceberg video, I actually wanted to extend it, and here we are. So with that, I really hope that you all enjoyed this video, and I'm really glad that you're happy that I'm back making content again. By the way, I absolutely pray that this iceberg doesn't get age restricted.
and get no ads, because that's happened on all of my Iceberg videos. Also, with this YouTube channel, I'm probably gonna be uploading like once every 2 weeks. I'm not gonna be uploading as often anymore, but what I'm gonna be doing is slowly easing out PSA content. I'm not gonna completely get rid of it, don't get me wrong, but I'm gonna slowly ease it down to where it's like one video is a PSA video, one video is something else, one a PSA video, one something else, and it keeps repeating. Also, while I'm here, please make sure to check out my Discord server in the description. I'd love to see you guys chatting in there. I want to get that started up again, get you all vibing over there. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, Patreon's back up. That's in the description too. Please check it out. And anyways, with all that out of the way, onto the Patreon shoutouts. So massive shout out to Diamond Pony and Madeline Stringer for supporting my $2 PSA Pirate tier. Massive thanks to Juliet Wakefield for supporting my $5 Pusher tier, and lastly, massive thanks to Sam M 1994 for supporting my $10 Pee Wee Herman tier. With that all done, I will see you all in the next video.